walk 900 miles in sandals for a splinter. You sleep on hay, drink from puddles, and pray your knees don't explode. Welcome to Holy Tourism, 14th century edition. The chill of autumn had long since settled into the bones of the Flemish village, a damp, persistent cold that clung to the peat smoke rising from thatched roofs and seeped through the rough wool of worn tunics. Life here, for most, was a relentless rhythm of sowing and reaping, spinning and weaving, punctuated by the tolling of the church bell and the murmurs of prayer. Ilara knew this rhythm intimately. Her days were spent at the loom, the clatter of the shuttle a constant companion, her fingers deftly guiding the warp and weft to create coarse cloth for the market. It was honest work, but honest work rarely yielded more than enough to ward off the gnawing hunger that was a familiar ache in her belly. Her small cottage, tucked beside others in a muddy lane, offered scant protection from the elements, and the years had etched lines of quiet desperation onto her young face, lines that spoke of dreams deferred and hopes slowly withering. Yet, even in the heart of such monotonous toil, a different kind of whisper began to stir, carried on the wind from beyond the familiar fields and forests. It spoke of distant lands, of sacred stones bathed in the light of a different sun, of martyrs whose very bones pulsed with divine power. These were the whispers of pilgrimage, the siren song of holy sites that promised not just a respite from earthly hardship, but a direct conduit to heavenly favor. For the weary and the faithful, for those burdened by loss or yearning for a miracle, these whispers offered an almost irresistible allure, a chance to trade the mud and toil of their lives for the promise of grace and salvation. The tales, passed from traveler to traveler, from pilgrim returning with stories etched onto their souls, spoke of Jerusalem, the city of Christ's suffering and resurrection, of Rome, the seat of Saint Peter, and of countless local shrines dedicated to saints whose names might be half forgotten, but whose power remained potent. In the dim light of the parish church, Brother Thomas listened, his heart a battlefield. As a monk, cloistered within the sturdy stone walls of the abbey, his life was meant to be one of quiet contemplation and unceasing prayer. He had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, seeking to shed the temptations of the world and draw closer to God. Yet the world stubbornly refused to be shed. It intruded in the form of the abbot's worldly concerns, the envious glances of his fellow brothers, and the insistent, nagging questions that gnawed at the edges of his faith. He yearned for a deeper understanding, a certainty that transcended the rituals and the dogma, a connection that felt as real and tangible as the calluses on his own hands. The tales of pilgrimage, filtering through the abbey's stone corridors, spoke of a direct encounter with the divine, of miraculous cures and profound spiritual awakenings. They painted a picture of a world where faith and fortune were not merely linked, but inextricably entwined, a potent, intoxicating blend that promised to resolve the very doubts that plagued him. Ilara, too, felt the pull. It was a subtle thing at first, a fleeting thought on a particularly arduous day, a quiet longing as she watched the traveling merchants pass through the village, their faces etched with the dust of distant roads. She had lost her mother to the sweating sickness years ago, a swift and brutal illness that had left a void in her life as profound as any spiritual emptiness. Her father, a good man but broken by grief, had followed soon after, leaving her to navigate the world alone. The loom was her solace, her sustenance, but it could not fill the emptiness that echoed in her small cottage. The stories of the saints, of their suffering and their ultimate triumph, resonated with a deep chord within her. If their pain, offered up to God, could earn them eternal glory, then perhaps her own suffering, her own quiet endurance, could also be a form of prayer, a pathway to something more. The prospect of journeying to a place where the divine had been demonstrably present, where miracles were said to occur with regularity, was a balm to her wounded spirit. It was an escape, yes, but more than that, it was a hope, a fragile seedling of possibility in the barren landscape of her everyday existence. The allure was not merely spiritual. The medieval world was one where the tangible and the divine were often blurred, where the miraculous was woven into the fabric of daily life. To embark on a pilgrimage was to step out of the mundane and into the extraordinary, to engage with a reality that was both more perilous and more wondrous than the one left behind. The promise of divine favor was not an abstract concept. It was believed to manifest in tangible ways: protection from illness, success in earthly ventures, and most importantly, the assurance of salvation in the afterlife. This was a world that understood the power of the physical, the potency of objects touched by the divine, and the journey to a holy site was the ultimate expression of this belief. It was a gamble, of course, a wager of time, effort, and precious resources, but for many, the potential rewards far outweighed the risks. The whispers of distant holy sites were not just whispers of faith, they were whispers of fortune, of a chance to rewrite one's destiny, to bargain with the divine for a better life, both here and in the hereafter. The tapestry of medieval life was rich and complex, and the threads of faith were woven through it with an undeniable strength. For individuals like Ilara, caught in the relentless churn of poverty and hardship, the call to the road was more than a religious impulse. It was a yearning for meaning, for a break in the monotony, for a chance to prove one's worth, not just to the earthly world, but to the heavenly one as well. Brother Thomas, wrestling with his own spiritual doubts and the temptations of the cloister, saw in pilgrimage a path to authenticity, a way to test his faith in the crucible of the world and emerge stronger, more certain. Their stories, though personal, were emblematic of a broader societal phenomenon, a collective yearning that drove countless souls onto the open road, seeking solace, salvation, and perhaps a touch of the miraculous in a world that often seemed devoid of it. The damp chill of Flanders was a constant reminder of life's limitations, but the whispers of distant holy sites offered a promise of transcendence, a call to step beyond the familiar and embrace the profound mysteries that lay beyond the horizon. The road, even in its nascent promise, was a departure from the predictable. For Ilara, whose world was bounded by the familiar streets of her village and the four walls of her weaving shed, the very idea of journeying beyond the nearest market town was a monumental undertaking. Her life had been one of quiet resilience, of making do, of finding comfort in the predictable rhythm of her craft. But the whispers had planted a seed of discontent, a subtle dissatisfaction with the known, a yearning for something more, something that the endless turning of her loom could not provide. She would watch the traveling merchants, their carts laden with goods from afar, their faces tanned and weathered, and a pang of envy would seize her. They had seen beyond the familiar horizon. They had experienced the world in a way that was utterly alien to her cloistered existence. The thought of Jerusalem, a city steeped in the blood of Christ, or Rome, the eternal city, seemed as distant and as fantastical as the moon. Yet the stories persisted, carried by peddlers and chance encounters, tales of miraculous healings, of divine intercessions, of saints whose presence still permeated certain sacred places. Brother Thomas, too, felt the stirrings of this unrest. His life within the abbey was one of order and discipline, a structured existence designed to cultivate spiritual purity. He had access to books, to learned discourse, and the teachings of the church were laid out for him in meticulous detail. But there was a disconnect, a chasm between the learned words and the lived experience of faith. He witnessed the hypocrisy among his brethren, the subtle rivalries for favor, the occasional lapses into worldly indulgence that undermined the very vows they had taken. He longed for a faith that was not mediated by the pronouncements of superiors or the rituals of the cloister, but a direct, unadulterated communion with the divine. The accounts of pilgrims who had walked in the footsteps of the apostles, who had knelt at the tombs of martyrs, who had witnessed the tangible remnants of sacred history, ignited a fire within him. These journeys were not mere travels, they were expeditions into the very heart of faith, opportunities to encounter God in ways that the quiet contemplation of the abbey could not fully replicate. The promise of pilgrimage was a potent antidote to the perceived failures of earthly life. In a world where disease was rampant, where famine was a constant threat, and where the justice of man was often arbitrary and cruel, the possibility of divine intervention was a powerful lure. A pilgrimage was not simply a journey, it was an investment in spiritual capital, a means of securing favor with a higher power. The very act of undertaking such a arduous journey was in itself a testament to one's devotion. It demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice, to endure hardship, and to place one's trust entirely in God's providence. For Alara, whose life had been marked by loss and a pervasive sense of powerlessness, the idea of actively seeking divine favor, of undertaking a journey that was recognized as inherently holy, was a deeply empowering one. It offered a path to agency, a way to actively participate in her own spiritual destiny, rather than passively accepting whatever fate befell her. The local shrines, too, held their own potent allure, while Jerusalem and Rome represented the pinnacles of Christian pilgrimage. The veneration of local saints and their associated holy places was a far more common and accessible practice for the majority of the faithful. A saint's tomb, a fragment of their bone preserved in a reliquary, a chapel built on the site of a miraculous event. These were focal points for devotion that were woven into the fabric of village life. These places offered a more immediate connection to the divine, a sense that God's power was present and accessible in their own corner of the world. The stories associated with these local sanctuaries were often deeply ingrained in the collective memory of the community, passed down through generations. They spoke of saints who had interceded on behalf of their village, who had protected them from plague or invasion, who had granted fertility to barren lands or healed the sick. These were not abstract legends, they were tangible affirmations of faith, imbuing the very landscape with sacred significance. The economic realities of the 14th century also played a significant role in shaping the appeal of pilgrimage. For many, particularly those in rural communities, opportunities for social mobility or economic advancement were severely limited. Life was often a struggle to maintain a precarious existence with little hope of significant improvement. A pilgrimage, while demanding considerable sacrifice, offered a potential, albeit uncertain, route to a better fortune. The tales of pilgrims returning with newfound wealth or with blessings that manifested in tangible improvements to their lives fueled this perception. It was a gamble, certainly, but for those with little to lose, the potential rewards of divine favor, of a miraculous turn of fortune, could make the risks seem manageable. The intertwining of faith and fortune was not a cynical exploitation. For many, it was a deeply held belief that God's grace could manifest in earthly blessings, and a pilgrimage was the most direct means of seeking such favor. The call to the road, therefore, was a multifaceted one, resonating with spiritual longing, a desire for escape, and a practical yearning for a better life. It was a testament to the enduring human need for hope in the face of adversity, and to the profound ways in which faith could shape individual lives and collective aspirations. The whispers of distant holy sites were not merely religious enticements, they were the echoes of a deeper yearning for meaning, for connection, and for the possibility of a life transformed, both in this world and the next. Ilara, the weaver, and Brother Thomas, the monk, were but two of countless souls who heard these whispers, their quiet lives poised on the brink of an extraordinary journey. A journey that would test their faith, challenge their perceptions, and ultimately forever alter the course of their lives. The road beckoned, a promise of the sacred intertwined with the stark realities of human existence. The allure of the road was inextricably tied to the very objects that pilgrims sought at their destinations, relics. These were not mere historical curiosities. They were believed to be conduits, potent vessels through which the divine grace of saints and martyrs could flow into the earthly realm. A pilgrim's journey was not simply an act of devotion, it was a quest for tangible contact with the sacred, a desire to hold, to see, to be in the very presence of that which had been touched by God. The belief was fervent, deeply ingrained in the medieval psyche, that a fragment of bone, a drop of dried blood, or even a sliver of wood from the true cross, possessed an inherent power that could protect, heal, and intercede. Consider the fragment of a saint's finger, encased in a reliquary of hammered gold and gleaming enamel. This was no ordinary bone. It was believed to be a piece of a person who had lived a life of extraordinary holiness, who had suffered for their faith, and who, through their martyrdom, had achieved a state of perpetual closeness to God. This relic, therefore, was thought to retain a portion of that saint's spiritual essence, a direct link to the divine power that had sustained them through torment. When a pilgrim knelt before such a relic, their prayers were not directed into the void. They were offered to a specific intermediary, someone whose earthly life and heavenly intercession were intrinsically bound to that very object. The effect was immediate, visceral. The relic was not just seen, it was felt. It was the focal point of an intense, concentrated act of faith, an act that could and was believed to move mountains, or at least cure a persistent cough or lift the burden of a troubled spirit. The display of relics was a carefully orchestrated spectacle designed to amplify their sacred power and to draw the faithful, often in overwhelming numbers. Imagine the scene within the cavernous nave of a grand cathedral, dimly lit by flickering votive candles. The air would be thick with the scent of incense and the murmur of thousands of voices, a low hum of anticipation. Then, as the moment arrived, a hushed silence would fall, broken only by the solemn chants of the clergy. A robed procession would emerge from the sacristy, bearing aloft the precious relics, often displayed on velvet cushions or within intricately carved shrines. These reliquaries themselves were works of art, crafted by skilled artisans to reflect the immense value and holiness of their contents. They were made of precious metals, adorned with jewels, and designed to catch and reflect the meager light, making the sacred objects within appear to glow with an unearthly luminescence. The crowd would surge forward, a tide of humanity pressed against the railings, craning their necks for a glimpse. Hands would reach out, often in vain, yearning to touch the reliquary, to feel the residual warmth of a saint's touch. Tears would stream down faces, prayers would be whispered, and the air would crackle with a palpable sense of spiritual excitement. This was not a passive experience. It was an active, fervent engagement with the divine. For the sick and the infirm, the hope was for a miraculous healing. They would present their afflicted limbs, their clouded eyes, their sores and puzzles, in the desperate hope that proximity to the relic, or even a touch from a priest who had handled it, might effect a cure. Many accounts exist, though often filtered through hagiographic lenses, of such cures, the lame suddenly walking, the blind regaining their sight, the fevered finding instant relief. These stories, whether entirely true, exaggerated, or embellished, became the lifeblood of pilgrimage, drawing ever more people to these sacred sites. The proliferation of relics was astonishing. While the major shrines held coveted fragments of the true cross or the bones of prominent apostles, countless other relics existed, often of more humble origin. The extra digit of Saint Barbara, a tooth of Saint Agatha, or even a vial containing the milk of the Virgin Mary. No fragment of a holy life was considered too insignificant to be venerated. Each had its own legend, its own story of discovery and transmission, passed down from generation to generation. These were not merely relics, they were narrative devices, bringing the stories of the saints to life and grounding them in the physical world. The very existence of such a diverse collection of sacred objects spoke to a deep-seated desire to find God and the saints in every aspect of life, to imbue the mundane with the miraculous. This fervent veneration, however, also cast a long shadow. The immense value placed upon relics inevitably led to their commercialization. The acquisition of new relics was a constant pursuit for monasteries and churches, and the trade in these sacred objects became a significant and often lucrative enterprise. Relics were found in unlikely places, their authenticity often vouched for by dubious means, and their provenance sometimes fabricated to enhance their desirability. This created a market where the demand for sacred objects often outstripped the genuine supply. It was not uncommon for a single saint to have multiple heads, arms, or even bodies claimed by different shrines, a testament to the ingenuity of those involved in the relic trade. The line between genuine, heartfelt faith and the manipulation of that faith for financial gain was often blurred, if it existed at all for many. For the pious pilgrim, the authenticity of the relic was paramount. But for the custodians of these sacred objects, the economic benefits were undeniable. Churches and monasteries relied heavily on the donations that flowed from pilgrims attracted by their relic collections. These funds were essential for their upkeep, for the support of their religious communities, and for the continuation of their charitable works. Thus, the promotion of relics became a vital aspect of their economic survival, a necessary component of their spiritual mission. This did not necessarily imply cynicism on the part of all churchmen. Many genuinely believed in the sanctity of the relics they possessed and saw their careful preservation and display as a sacred duty. They were intermediaries, custodians of God's power on earth, and their role was to facilitate the connection between the faithful and the divine. However, the financial incentives, coupled with the competitive nature of shrine visitation, created an environment where the temptation to exaggerate claims, to embellish stories, or even to procure relics through less than scrupulous means was ever present. The pilgrim arriving at a major shrine was often confronted with a bewildering array of relics, each with its own attendant clergy, eager to share its miraculous history and to encourage donations. The atmosphere could be overwhelming, a cacophony of appeals, of fervent prayers, and fervent commercial pitches. Imagine the experience of a humble farmer arriving at a renowned shrine after months of arduous travel, only to be met with a complex system of ticketed access to certain relics, or the expectation of significant offerings for a personal blessing from a relic bearing priest. The spiritual journey could quickly become entangled with the economic realities of shrine management. This duality, this interplay of the sacred and the commercial, was an intrinsic part of the relic's allure. The very fact that these objects were so highly valued, so sought after, and so elaborately displayed enhanced their perceived power. The immense crowds that gathered, the wealth of the reliquaries, the elaborate rituals surrounding their presentation, all of these elements contributed to the aura of the miraculous. For the pilgrim, the economic investment, the hardship of the journey, and the act of donation were all part of the sacrifice, a tangible demonstration of their faith and crucial component of their bargaining with the divine. They were not merely buying access, they were investing in their salvation, and in the medieval mind, such investments were often rewarded. The relic's power was amplified by the devotion, and the devotion was, in turn, fueled by the promise of a tangible return, a divine favor made manifest through the sacred object. The entire ecosystem revolved around this intricate dance between spiritual longing and earthly value, a dance that drew countless souls onto the road, seeking a touch of the divine in the very bones of the departed. The air in Alara's small cottage seemed to hold its breath, mirroring the quiet anxiety that settled within her. The decision had been made, a silent vow whispered under the disapproving gaze of the chipped plaster saint on her wall. The road beckoned, not with promises of glittering treasures or heroic deeds, but with the austere call of faith, a summons that demanded sacrifice before it offered any solace. Preparing for such a journey was a stark contrast to the romantic notions sometimes spun in ballad and verse. It was a deeply practical, often gut wrenching process of shedding the familiar, of stripping away the non essential, and of confronting the precariousness of one's own existence. Her meager possessions, already few, suddenly felt like an embarrassment of riches. The spinning wheel, a constant companion in the long evenings, its familiar hum a lullaby to her solitary life, had to be considered. It represented weeks of laborious work, the very threads of her existence woven into its sturdy frame. Yet it was a luxury she could not afford to carry, nor could she leave it to be pilfered by opportunistic hands. With a sigh that felt heavier than any physical burden, she began to assess what little she could convert into coin. A few carefully hoarded silver pennies, earned from mending the vicar's cassock and selling a portions of her meager herb garden's bounty, were all she possessed. Even these felt insufficient, a paltry sum against the vastness of the journey ahead. The thought of selling the spinning wheel brought a pang of genuine grief, as if she were severing a limb. It was more than just an object, it was a symbol of her independence, her ability to provide for herself, however humbly. Yet, the image of a distant shrine, a beacon of hope, flickered in her mind, eclipsing the immediate sting of loss. Her worn leather shoes, once serviceable for market days and occasional visits to neighboring villages, were now subjected to a harsh scrutiny. The soles were thinning, the stitching around the sides threatening to give way with every step. They would need to be reinforced, mended with what little leather and thread she could spare from her own mending kit. She found a thick piece of salvaged hide, rough and unyielding, and began the painstaking work of patching the worn areas, her fingers fumbling with the awl and needle. Each stitch was a prayer, a plea for durability, for the strength to carry her through the unforgiving terrain. Then there was the cloak, the rough woolen garment, her primary defense against the biting winds and chilling rains of their region, was also showing signs of wear. A few crucial seams had begun to fray, and a small tear near the hem, sustained during a recent unexpected downpour, needed careful repair. She sourced the strongest yarn she could find, dyed a deep, serviceable brown, and began to work, focusing on making the repairs as robust as possible, prioritizing function over any semblance of adornment. Brother Thomas, meanwhile, found himself poring over maps that were more legend than cartography. These were not the neat, printed charts of a later age, but hand drawn parchments, their lines faded, their annotations often cryptic, passed down through generations of monks. He traced the winding courses of rivers, the formidable outlines of mountain ranges, and the faint dotted lines that indicated ancient pilgrimage routes. Each route was a tapestry woven with tales of hardship and devotion, punctuated by the names of wayside shrines and monastic hospices. His vows, once a clear path of prayer and contemplation within the cloistered walls, now seemed to demand a more active, peripatetic engagement with the world. He sought not relics in the same fervent way as many lay pilgrims, but a deeper understanding, a more profound connection to the divine that he felt could only be forged through direct experience of the arduous paths trod by the faithful. His preparation was a stark contrast to Ilara's solitary struggle, yet no less imbued with a sense of purpose. Within the scriptorium, surrounded by the hushed rustle of parchment and the faint scent of ink and beeswax, he consulted ancient texts on herbal remedies and basic survival. He learned about the properties of various plants that might offer succor for ailments encountered on the road: willow bark for pain, comfrey for bruises, and the ubiquitous plantain for cuts and insect stings. He practiced knot tying, essential for securing provisions and making rudimentary repairs to his worn sandals. The tenets of communal living within the monastery, while providing a framework for shared resources, had done little to prepare him for the stark reality of solitary reliance on one's own knowledge and preparedness. The purchasing of provisions was a sobering affair. Ilara's small purse yielded little. Dried bread, hard as stone, and meant to be softened in water, formed the bulk of her edible stores. A small pouch of dried peas, a source of protein, was a precious commodity. A sliver of salted meat, a luxury she had been saving for a special occasion, was now deemed essential for the journey. She bartered for a small, well made wooden staff, its top smoothed from years of use by other travelers, its sturdy shaft promising a reliable companion on uneven paths. It was a simple tool, but its very existence represented a conscious effort to equip herself for the physical demands that lay ahead. Brother Thomas, guided by the practical wisdom of the monastery's infirmary, acquired a small leather satchel containing essentials: a flint and steel for fire starting, a small whetstone to maintain the edge of his knife, and a tightly rolled woolen blanket. He purchased a generous supply of dried beans and a large, tightly woven linen bag for carrying water, its porous nature offering a degree of cooling through evaporation. The procurement of these items was not a casual shopping trip. It was a meticulous gathering of resources, each item chosen with careful consideration for its utility and durability. The most agonizing part of the preparation, however, was the farewells. For Ilara, it meant bidding goodbye to the few neighbors who had offered her kindness. A nod and a murmured prayer from the baker's wife, a hesitant wave from the blacksmith's son. Her departure was not marked by fanfare or public lamentation. It was a quiet slipping away, a dissolution into the anonymity of the road, the absence of family, a void she had long carried, made this part of the journey a particular agony. There were no tearful reunions to anticipate, no familiar faces to offer reassurance. She was alone, truly alone, with only her faith and her hastily assembled provisions for company. Brother Thomas's farewells were of a different nature. The abbot, a man whose stern countenance hid a deep well of compassion, blessed his journey, his words a mixture of caution and encouragement. The other monks, each immersed in their own spiritual struggles and duties, offered quiet blessings and handshakes, a shared understanding passing between them of the profound undertaking that lay before their brother. It was a farewell to community, to the predictable rhythm of monastic life, a step into an unknown that was both daunting and, for him, strangely exhilarating. He left with the knowledge that his brothers would pray for his safety, a spiritual tether that, while intangible, offered a powerful sense of reassurance. The stark realities of medieval provisioning for such an undertaking were laid bare in these preparations. There was no ready market for specialized pilgrimage gear, no readily available guides offering comfort and security. Survival depended on a keen eye for useful materials, a willingness to mend and repurpose, and a deep reservoir of personal fortitude. The weight of the few coins Alara possessed, the roughness of the wool against her skin, the unyielding hardness of the dried bread, these were the tangible manifestations of her faith, the physical embodiment of her commitment to the call. The journey was not a holiday. It was an act of profound self denial, a willingness to embrace hardship for the promise of spiritual reward. Every mended seam, every carefully packed provision, was a testament to the immense personal sacrifice that lay at the heart of the medieval pilgrimage. The road ahead was not paved with good intentions alone, but with calloused hands, weary feet, and a spirit braced for the trials to come. The first steps were not marked by trumpets or the gathering of crowds. Instead, they were swallowed by the indifferent hush of dawn. Ilara, her meager possessions bundled and slung over her shoulder, her newly reinforced shoes biting into the damp earth, turned her back on the village that had been the entirety of her world. The familiar cluster of thatched roofs, the leaning spire of the church, the very stones of the path she'd trod 1,000 times, all receded behind her with a quiet finality. A knot of apprehension tightened in her stomach, a cold counterpoint to the burgeoning thrum of anticipation. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of dew-kissed clover, a starkly beautiful farewell from the land she was leaving. Each footfall on the well-worn track felt both heavy with the weight of her decision and strangely buoyant, a release from the predictable currents of her former life. The road, initially a comforting ribbon of familiar gray, soon began to curve and broaden, leading her away from the comforting geometry of the village and into the wilder, untamed embrace of the countryside. Brother Thomas, too, moved with a silent resolve. He emerged from the monastery gates, not with a flourish, but with the same humble demeanor he carried within its walls. The heavy oak door swung shut behind him with a resonant boom that seemed to echo the finality of his departure from that cloistered sanctuary. His worn woolen habit, bleached by sun and washed by rain, was a familiar sight to his brothers, but now it was cinched tighter, ready for the rigors of the road. He carried his staff, a simple length of sturdy ash, not as a weapon, but as a steadying presence, a connection to the earth beneath his feet. The familiar chants and the rhythmic scraping of quills in the scriptorium were replaced by the murmur of his own murmured Latin prayers, a constant, low hum that accompanied his every stride. The initial miles were a transition, not just of geography, but of the very texture of his existence. The soft flagstones of the cloister gave way to the uneven, stony track leading out of the monastery grounds, and the predictable schedule of prayer and labor was replaced by the unwritten laws of the journey. The landscape, at first, offered a deceptive comfort. Rolling fields of ripening grain stretched out under a pale sky, their golden heads swaying like a gentle, welcoming sea. The familiar shape of the hills, the distant hazy outline of the northern range, still felt like a part of home. But as the day wore on, and the village lights vanished from view entirely, a subtle shift occurred. The fields began to give way to denser woodlands, ancient oaks and beeches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The path, once clearly defined, became a more uncertain track, winding through thickets of brambles and over gnarled roots that threatened to trip the unwary traveler. The air grew cooler, heavier with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the resinous tang of pine. The silence here was different from the sacred quiet of the monastery. It was a wilder, more watchful silence, alive with the rustle of unseen creatures and the whisper of the wind through the high branches. For Ilara, the physical reality of the journey asserted itself with relentless immediacy. The weight of her bundle, initially manageable, began to press down on her shoulders, a constant dull ache that spread through her back and into her limbs. Her feet, accustomed to the relatively soft ground within the village or the worn pathways between cottages, began to protest the rougher terrain. The soles of her mended shoes, though strengthened, were still thin, and every sharp stone, every protruding root, sent a jolt of discomfort upwards. She focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the steady swing of her arms, and the mantra of her prayers to keep the growing fatigue at bay. The dried bread, her sustenance, was indeed as hard as she had anticipated. She broke off small pieces, nibbling at them slowly, allowing the rough texture to soften slightly in her mouth, a meager but necessary fuel for her body. The salted meat, rationed with a careful hand, offered a welcome burst of savory flavor, a brief respite from the blandness of the bread. Brother Thomas, too, felt the unfamiliar strain. While his monastic life involved periods of manual labor, such as tending the monastery gardens, it was a structured exertion, punctuated by periods of rest and nourishment. The continuous, unyielding demand of the road was a different kind of trial. His sandals, well worn but sturdy, protected his feet reasonably well, but the sheer mileage began to take its toll. His legs ached. His shoulders felt the constant pull of the satchel containing his few worldly possessions, and a gnawing hunger, deeper than any he had experienced within the monastery's communal refectory, began to make itself known. He found himself thinking about the simple, yet satisfying meals shared with his brothers, a pang of longing for that easy abundance surfacing amidst his spiritual reflections. Yet he pushed on, drawing strength from the Latin phrases that flowed through his mind, each word a testament to his commitment, each syllable a prayer for perseverance. The sounds of the journey began to weave their own tapestry. The ever-present crunch of their boots on the varied surfaces of the path was the constant bass note. Interspersed were the calls of birds, some familiar, some strange and wild, their cries echoing through the trees. The gurgle of streams, the sigh of the wind, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. These were the natural symphonies that accompanied their progress. When they encountered other travelers, the sounds changed. The murmur of voices, speaking in a variety of dialects, the creak of cartwheels, the jingle of harness bells, the bark of a dog. These were the sounds of human passage, fleeting encounters that punctuated the vastness of the wilderness. Ilara, an ever cautious, kept her gaze lowered when others approached, a habit born of her solitary life. But her ears strained to catch any useful snippet of conversation, any indication of the road ahead. Brother Thomas, with a nod and a customary pax vobiscum, would offer a blessing to those he met, a small gesture of communion in their shared journey. The sheer physical exertion was a humbling teacher. It stripped away any lingering romantic notions of pilgrimage, replacing them with the stark reality of aching muscles, parched throats, and the persistent low grade discomfort of fatigue. The concept of miles became a tangible, bone weary reality. What on a map might seem a straightforward distance became, on foot, an arduous undertaking, each step a conscious effort. The inclination of the land, the resistance of the ground beneath their feet, the unpredictable shifts in weather, all conspired to make the journey a constant negotiation with the physical world. For Elara, who had known only the predictable labor of domestic tasks, this relentless, sustained effort was a new dimension of experience. Her hands, roughened from mending and spinning, began to develop calluses from gripping her staff. Her feet, though protected, felt every pebble, every uneven patch of earth. Brother Thomas, accustomed to the discipline of his vows, found a different sort of discipline in the demands of the road. The hours spent in prayer were now interspersed with hours spent in motion, his mind shifting between devotional contemplation and the practical concerns of navigation and survival. He observed the subtle signs of the path, the way the vegetation grew, the direction of the water flow, drawing on the knowledge gleaned from his studies. He learned to recognize the calls of birds that signaled approaching rain, to find shelter beneath dense foliage when the skies opened unexpectedly. The simple act of walking, sustained for hours on end, became a form of meditation in itself, a moving prayer that carried him forward. He understood that the spiritual journey was intrinsically linked to the physical one. The body's endurance was a crucible for the soul's refinement. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the land, the need for rest became paramount. Finding suitable shelter was another challenge. The notion of inns or hospices, while existing in some regions, was not a given, especially on lesser traveled routes. They learned to scan the landscape for natural shelters, the overhang of a rock, the dense branches of a large tree, a shallow cave. The preparation of a simple meal became a ritual. Ilara would find a relatively flat, dry spot, build a small, contained fire with the few twigs she could gather, and carefully heat a portion of her dried peas, or perhaps a piece of her bread, to make it more palatable. Brother Thomas, with his flint and steel, was more adept at starting fires, and his woolen blanket, though rough, offered a welcome warmth against the encroaching chill of the evening. The quiet of the night was a different kind of solitude. Away from the sounds of human habitation, the wilderness came alive with its own nocturnal chorus. The hoot of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of leaves as unseen animals moved through the undergrowth. These were sounds that could stir a primal fear, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Ilara would huddle close to the dying embers of the fire, her hand resting on her staff, her prayers now more fervent, seeking protection from the unknown. Brother Thomas, ever the scholar, would often consult his mental library of scriptures, finding solace in the words of comfort and faith, his breath misting in the cool night air as he repeated passages from the Psalms. The sheer scale of the world outside the confines of their previous lives was an overwhelming yet exhilarating revelation. The familiar horizon of their village had been a comforting boundary. But now, as they looked out across miles of undulating countryside, of dense forests and distant, mist shrouded mountains, they felt both a sense of awe and a dawning realization of their own insignificance in the grand tapestry of creation. Each sunrise was a renewal of purpose, a fresh canvas upon which to paint the day's journey, and each sunset a marker of progress, a testament to their endurance. The road, that ever present companion, was leading them not only towards a physical destination, but deeper into themselves, stripping away the familiar, testing their resolve, and forging them anew with every arduous mile. The first steps were taken in quiet determination, but the miles that followed were a profound education, a baptism by nature and by the sheer, unyielding reality of the journey itself. The road, though it promised spiritual uplift and perhaps even earthly rewards, was no gentle promenade. Before the shadow of human malevolence even flickered across their path, Ilara and Brother Thomas found themselves in a constant, quiet battle against the raw, untamed forces of nature. The very earth beneath their feet, which had seemed so solid and familiar within the village confines, could become a treacherous adversary. Rivers, swollen by recent rains, or melting snows from distant peaks, presented formidable obstacles. A seemingly placid stream could, in a matter of hours, transform into a raging torrent, its currents powerful enough to sweep away even the strongest swimmer. The crossing of such watercourses, often achieved by fording shallow sections or precariously balancing on moss-slicked stones, was a moment of heart-stopping tension. Ilara, accustomed to drawing water from the village well, found the sheer, untamed power of moving water both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The cold shock of immersion, the relentless pull of the current against her legs, demanded every ounce of her strength and focus. Brother Thomas, his prayers a low hum against the roar of the water, would often extend his staff to Ilara, a simple gesture of support that spoke volumes in their shared vulnerability. The sky, too, was a capricious master. A clear morning could give way to a bruised, ominous sky with startling speed. Medieval weather forecasting was a rudimentary art relying on the observation of cloud formations, wind direction, and the behavior of animals. A sudden shift in the wind, the gathering of dark clouds on the horizon, or the unusual silence of birds could herald an impending tempest. When the heavens opened, the downpour was not a gentle shower, but a violent deluge, turning the tracks into muddy quagmires and the fields into sodden sponges. Rain lashed down with a ferocity that could soak a traveler to the bone in minutes, chilling them to the marrow and threatening to extinguish the precious warmth of their meager fires. Finding shelter became a desperate, urgent quest. A dense thicket of trees might offer a modicum of protection, but often it was a mere illusion, the rain finding its way through the canopy to drip relentlessly onto those seeking refuge. Brother Thomas, with his woolen habit, offered some insulation, but even he could not entirely ward off the deep, penetrating cold that seeped into his bones. Gilara, her cloak already heavy with moisture, would huddle against the rough bark of a tree, shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering, her thoughts turning to the warmth of her cottage hearth, a memory that seemed impossibly distant. Beyond the immediate threats of water and weather lay the insidious danger of illness. The medieval world, for all its burgeoning faith and developing philosophies, was largely ignorant of the microscopic agents that caused disease. Contaminated water was a frequent culprit. A seemingly clear stream could be tainted with the waste of livestock, or worse, the effluvia of previous travelers who had succumbed to illness. Ilara remembered the common ailments that swept through her village, the agues that brought on chills and fevers, the flux that racked the stomach, the coughs that rattled the chest. These were now not distant fears, but ever present possibilities. A single sip of tainted water could lay a person low, turning a robust traveler into a weakened invalid within days. The simple act of drinking, so essential for survival, became an act of faith in itself, a prayer that the water was clean, a plea for the Almighty to spare them from unseen poisons. Brother Thomas, having spent his life within the relatively controlled environment of the monastery, was perhaps less accustomed to the sheer pervasiveness of potential contagion. While monastic communities maintained a degree of sanitation, the open road was a different matter entirely. He understood, from his studies of ancient texts, the concept of humors and their balance, but the practical implications of miasmas and unseen pestilence were less clear. He carried a small pouch of herbs, carefully dried and chosen for their purported medicinal properties, but these were often more palliative than curative. The fear of a sudden fever, striking in the dead of night with no one to tend to them, was a gnawing anxiety. Imagine the chilling dread as a shiver, deeper than any induced by the cold, began to rack the body. The skin would grow hot and dry, the head would pound, and the world would begin to spin. In such a state, the spiritual journey could quickly devolve into a desperate fight for mere survival. Ilara, remembering her grandmother's remedies, would try to soothe a feverish brow with cool water, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her efforts might be in vain. The hunger that often accompanied illness would only exacerbate their weakness, making the already meager rations seem impossibly large. The unsanitary conditions that permeated much of the medieval world were also a constant threat. The roads themselves, often little more than rutted tracks churned by cartwheels and livestock, were frequently littered with refuse. Villages, while picturesque from a distance, could harbor unsavory odors and breeding grounds for disease. The lack of proper waste disposal meant that animal dung, human waste, and decaying organic matter were often left to accumulate, creating a pervasive miasma that could be inhaled with every breath. Even the air, so vital for life, could carry the seeds of sickness. Ilara, whose village had a communal midden heap some distance away, was none the less aware of the ever-present possibility of encountering far worse conditions on the open road. The smell of decay, the sight of flies buzzing around refuse, the sheer indifference to cleanliness that characterized many resting places, all contributed to a growing sense of unease. Accidents, too, were an ever-present danger, stemming from the same unpredictable nature of the road. A misstep on a steep incline, a fall from a precarious riverbank, or an unexpected entanglement with overgrown thorns could lead to sprains, broken bones, or deep lacerations. Without access to skilled surgeons or sterile dressings, even a seemingly minor injury could become a life-threatening complication, prone to infection and festering. Ilara, whose hands were accustomed to the delicate work of needle and thread, found herself relying on them more than ever, not for mending cloth, but for preparing simple bandages from strips of her own clothing to staunch bleeding. Brother Thomas, his knowledge of anatomy limited to the scriptures and a few learned texts, understood the fragility of the human body. He knew that a broken bone, improperly set, would knit crookedly, leading to a lifetime of pain and deformity. The vulnerability was absolute. Their faith was their shield, but their bodies were made of flesh and blood, susceptible to the harsh realities of a world that offered little in the way of modern medical intervention. The stark contrast between their spiritual aspirations and their physical fragility was a constant, unspoken tension. They had embarked on this journey with hearts full of faith, seeking divine favor, perhaps even miracles. Yet, they were also acutely aware of their mortal coil, of the body's limitations and its susceptibility to the whims of fortune and the elements. The arduous climb up a steep hill, their lungs burning, their legs trembling with fatigue, was a physical manifestation of their struggle. The gnawing hunger that gnawed at their stomachs, a reminder of their dependence on sustenance, was a humbling counterpoint to their loftier goals. Each ache, each chill, each moment of fear was a test, a trial by nature that served to temper their resolve. Imagine for a moment the chilling fear as a fever takes hold during a cold night, huddled beneath a thin wool blanket, the fire reduced to a few glowing embers. The world outside the small circle of light is a vast, indifferent darkness, alive with rustles and unknown sounds. The body, once a reliable vessel, now feels alien, a source of torment. The mind, clouded by fever, conjures phantom images, twisting familiar shapes into monstrous forms. The prayers, usually a source of solace, become desperate pleas, whispered against the pounding of a heart that feels like a trapped bird. Or consider the sheer desperation to find shelter from a torrential downpour that turns the very air into a sheet of water, obscuring all vision, battering against clothing and flesh with relentless force. The ground beneath their feet becomes a bog, sucking at their boots, threatening to pull them down. Every instinct screams for dryness, for warmth, for an end to the battering, but the road offers only more exposure, more relentless assault. This constant negotiation with the natural world was in its own way a form of spiritual discipline. It stripped away pretense and forced a confrontation with their own limitations. The road demanded humility, a recognition that their human endeavors, however noble, were always subject to forces far greater than themselves. It taught them to appreciate the small mercies, a dry patch of ground to rest upon, a patch of edible berries found by the wayside, a brief respite from the wind. It was a world where faith was not merely a matter of belief, but a vital, active force that sustained them through physical hardship. Their journey was a testament to the human spirit's resilience, a fragile flame of devotion flickering bravely against the vast, often unforgiving canvas of the medieval landscape. The spiritual quest was inextricably bound to the physical one. The path to the divine was paved not just with prayer, but with endurance, fortitude, and a profound respect for the very earth that carried them forward, an earth that could nurture and sustain, but also, with a terrible swiftness, could break and destroy. The twilight deepened, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, a fitting prelude to the night's discomfort. The rough hewn walls of the barn offered little more than a semblance of shelter, a barrier against the biting wind that still whispered through the cracks. Ilara pulled the rough wool of her cloak tighter, though it did little to ward off the pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her. The floor was a thick carpet of straw, damp and smelling faintly of urine and the lingering aroma of hay. Scattered throughout the barn were other travelers, huddled figures lost in the gloom, their forms barely discernible in the flickering light cast by a single sputtering lantern near the entrance. The air was thick with a cacophony of sounds, the restless shifting of unseen bodies, the rustle of straw as someone turned over, the soft, ragged breathing of those already asleep, and, most disturbingly, the low groans of the unwell. Ilara's eyes, accustomed to the familiar dimness of her cottage hearth, struggled to adjust. The shapes around her resolved themselves into fellow pilgrims, peasants like herself, and a few weathered faces that might have belonged to merchants or lesser gentry traveling with reduced retinues. There were no introductions, no polite inquiries about their journeys. Each person was an island, seeking solace in the shared misery of the night. Beside her, a woman coughed, a deep, rattling sound that seemed to echo the very fragility of life on the road. Nearby, a child whimpered, its cries muffled by a tired mother's hand. The smell was overpowering, a pungent blend of ammonia from animal droppings, the earthy scent of damp straw, and the unmistakable odor of unwashed bodies, all underscored by the ever present miasma of livestock that had doubtless occupied this space before them. Two scrawny chickens, long past their prime laying years, pecked listlessly at the straw near the doorway, their presence a stark reminder of the barn's primary purpose. A pair of weary oxen, their breath misting in the cool air, were tethered to a thick wooden post at the far end of the structure, their occasional snorts and the creak of their wooden yokes adding to the nocturnal symphony of discomfort. Brother Thomas, who had managed to secure a relatively dry patch of straw near the wall, sat with his back propped against the rough timber. Even his accustomed monastic austerity seemed tested by the conditions. He had known the simplicity of a cell, the quiet reverence of communal prayer, the clean scent of incense and beeswax. But this was a different order of hardship. The lack of privacy was particularly jarring. While monasteries adhered to strict rules of modesty, there was an inherent respect for personal space. Here, one was thrust into an uncomfortably intimate proximity with strangers, their personal habits and ailments exposed without preamble. He could hear the labored breathing of a man across the narrow aisle, the faint snore of another. Every shuffle and sigh was amplified in the hushed stillness of the night, a constant, low-level hum of human vulnerability. He closed his eyes, seeking the familiar rhythm of monastic chant, but the reality of the barn kept intruding. Ilara's own thoughts drifted, a restless tide of worry and weariness. The stories she had overheard earlier in the day, whispered by those who had been on the road longer, now echoed in her mind. Tales of thieves who stalked the shadowed woods, of sicknesses that struck without warning, of the sheer, grinding exhaustion that could break the strongest spirit. This barn, while offering a roof, also felt like a potential trap. The close quarters, the lingering smells, the proximity of the sick. It all heightened the unspoken fear of contagion. She remembered the fever that had swept through her village 2 winters ago, the way it had claimed old Agnes and young Wat within days of each other. The memory was a cold knot in her stomach. Was this where it began? A shared breath, a misplaced cough, a droplet of moisture from a sickened traveler's lip landing unseen on the straw. She shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position, but the straw offered little cushioning. It prickled her skin through the thin linen of her shift and the rough wool of her cloak. The sounds of the barn seemed to coalesce into a single, murmuring presence, a collective sigh of exhaustion and apprehension. She could hear the faint scraping of a knife against leather as someone carefully sharpened their blade, a sound that sent a ripple of unease through her. Survival on the road demanded vigilance, and even in the supposed safety of a barn, the threat of malevolence lingered. Brother Thomas, sensing her disquiet, turned his head slightly. "Peace, child," he murmured, his voice low and soothing, though it barely carried over the ambient noise. "The Lord watches over us, even in such humble places." His words were a comfort, a small ember of warmth in the encroaching darkness, but Ilara could not entirely shake the chill. She imagined herself, or worse, Brother Thomas, falling ill. Who would tend to them? In a monastery, there were infirmarers, herbalists, the practiced hands of brothers trained to care for the sick. Here, there was only the fickle kindness of strangers and the prayers of those who were themselves vulnerable. The very air seemed to press in, heavy with the scent of hay, manure, and the undeniable aroma of humanity in close quarters. It was a visceral reminder of their shared, fragile existence. No longer was there the gentle separation of a small cottage, the curated scents of herbs drying by the hearth, or the clean, cool air of the open fields. This was the unvarnished reality of communal living, stripped of all pretense. The barn was a microcosm of the road itself, a place where comfort was scarce, privacy a luxury, and the ever-present threat of disease a constant companion. Ilara pulled her knees to her chest, tucking her chin against her chest, trying to conserve what little warmth her body possessed. She listened to the breathing, the sighs, the occasional murmur of a half-woken traveler. Each sound was a story, a testament to the trials of those who sought solace or salvation on this arduous path. The stories exchanged in hushed tones were a potent mix of hope and despair. A man with a scarred face, his voice raspy, spoke of a town further along the route where a benevolent abbot offered food and shelter to pilgrims, a rare oasis in the wilderness. Another, his face gaunt and shadowed, warned of a particular stretch of road known for its brigands, their cruelty legendary. These whispers, carried on the damp air, painted a vivid tapestry of the journey ahead, each anecdote a potential hazard to be noted, a warning to be heeded. Ilara absorbed them all, filing them away in her mind, a growing apprehension mingling with a stubborn determination. Brother Thomas, too, was absorbing these fragments of knowledge. He understood the monastic commitment to hospitality, but the scale and the nature of this road-weary fraternity were different. Monks offered succor to those who came in faith, often with some degree of organization and preparation. This was a chaotic, emergent community, bound only by the shared hardship of the road. He wondered about the efficacy of his own small pouch of dried herbs, the few Latin prayers he had memorized for ailments. Were they enough against the myriad of diseases that seemed to fester in such conditions? He glanced at Alara, her slight frame huddled against the cold. She was strong, he knew, her spirit resilient, but her body was as vulnerable as any other. The concept of personal space, a notion largely unexamined in their village lives, where families shared cramped dwellings, took on a new dimension in the communal barn. It wasn't just about physical proximity, it was about the invisible boundaries that protected one's sense of self. Here, those boundaries were irrevocably breached. The casual intimacy of strangers sharing the same air, the same straw, the same potential for illness was a profound disruption of that inner sanctum. Ilara found herself acutely aware of the bodies around her, of their heat, their exhalations, their sheer presence. It was a constant, low level sensory overload that made true rest impossible. She imagined the stories these people carried within them, the reasons for their pilgrimage, the burdens they bore. But the overwhelming reality was the shared physical discomfort, the primal need for warmth and safety, and the gnawing anxiety of what the night might bring. The straw, while theoretically cushioning, was a breeding ground for all manner of tiny creatures. Ilara felt the tickle of unseen movement against her skin, the imagined crawl of insects. She resisted the urge to scratch, knowing it would only draw attention and perhaps invite unwanted conversation. The night was a long, drawn out ordeal. Each hour was marked by the shifting weight of bodies, the deepening chill, and the continued subtle sounds of human suffering and endurance. The moonlight, filtering weakly through the gaps in the wooden walls, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and flickered, playing tricks on the eye. These shadows seemed to imbue the barn with a life of its own, a restless spirit of the road that mirrored the unease in Alara's own heart. Brother Thomas, ever the observer, noted the subtle differences in how people reacted to the night. Some, like Ilara, were clearly unnerved, their bodies tense, their breathing shallow. Others seemed to have surrendered to the inevitable, their snores deep and rhythmic, their bodies slack with exhaustion. A few, perhaps hardened by longer journeys, remained vigilant, their eyes still open, their senses alert even in the dim light. He recognized the spectrum of human resilience, the myriad ways people coped with hardship. His own role, as he saw it, was to offer whatever small measure of comfort and spiritual reassurance he could, to be a steady presence amidst the uncertainty. The contrast with her familiar life was stark. Back home, the night meant the security of her own bed, the predictable sounds of her village settling down, the comforting weight of her patchwork quilt. Here, the night was an adversary, a prolonged period of exposure and vulnerability. The simple act of sleeping, a natural and restorative process, had become a conscious effort, a battle against the elements and the proximity of others. She longed for the dawn, for the first rays of sun that would signal the end of this communal ordeal, even as she knew that the road would present new challenges with the coming day. The barn was merely a temporary pause, a brief respite before the journey resumed. The unspoken fear of disease was a constant undercurrent. In a place like this, where the air was close and the sanitation non existent, it felt as though sickness was perpetually waiting to pounce. A simple cut from a sharp straw, a scratch on the skin from the rough wool, could become an entry point for unseen infections. Ilara remembered the hushed conversations in her village about the importance of cleanliness, of washing hands, of keeping food covered. These were simple practices, yet on the road they were often impossible to maintain. The very act of traveling seemed to invite contamination, and the shared accommodations, while offering shelter, also amplified the risk. She found herself unconsciously shielding her mouth with her hand, a futile gesture against an invisible threat. Brother Thomas, too, felt the weight of this unspoken fear. While his monastic vows demanded a certain asceticism, it was a chosen discipline, an ordered withdrawal from the world. This enforced proximity to strangers, to their potentially unclean bodies and habits, was a different kind of test. He had studied the ancient texts that spoke of pestilence and contagion, but the practical reality was far more daunting than any learned discourse. He prayed that his own constitution, honed by years of simple monastic fare and a disciplined life, would be strong enough to resist whatever lurked in the damp air and the unsanitary conditions. He thought of the stories of the Black Death, a terrifying memory that lingered in the collective consciousness of Christendom, a stark reminder of how quickly disease could sweep through a population, leaving devastation in its wake. While this was a far cry from such a widespread plague, the same principles of contagion were surely at play, albeit on a smaller, more localized scale. The groans and coughs continued, a mournful testament to the physical toll of the journey. Ilara's mind, exhausted but unwilling to rest, began to construct elaborate scenarios. What if she woke in the night, feverish and disoriented? Who would help her? Would Brother Thomas be able to manage alone? The thought was a sharp pang of fear, a reminder of her own dependence on him and his on her, a fragile partnership forged in faith and necessity. The barn, which at first had seemed a mere inconvenience, now felt like a stark symbol of their precarious existence. It was a place where the boundaries between individuals blurred, where the shared vulnerability was palpable, and where the potential for suffering seemed to multiply with every breath drawn in the close, stale air. The journey, she was beginning to understand, was not just about reaching a destination, but about enduring the passage itself in all its unvarnished, uncomfortable reality. The night wore on, each hour a slow, agonizing crawl. Ilara found herself counting the rafters, the uneven planks of the walls, the number of breathing bodies she could discern in the gloom. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and shallow, punctuated by the persistent discomfort and the lingering anxieties of the day. Her dreams were a jumble of rough straw, pungent odors, and the worried faces of her fellow travelers. The dawn, when it finally broke, was not a glorious awakening, but a welcome release, a signal that this particular trial had passed, and that the road, with all its uncertainties, lay once more before them. The barn, with its damp straw and close packed bodies, was a stark but necessary lesson in the realities of pilgrimage, a reminder that the path to salvation was often paved with discomfort, hardship, and a profound shared vulnerability. She rose stiffly, her limbs aching from the unyielding ground and the cold night air, and met Brother Thomas's weary gaze. His eyes, though tired, held a flicker of quiet resolve. The journey continued. The chill of the night in the barn had been a discomfort, a prelude to the trials that truly defined the road. Now, as the first weak fingers of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in bruised hues of gray and rose, a different kind of unease settled upon the weary travelers. The air, though still carrying the damp scent of the earth and the lingering odor of the barn, now also held a sharp, expectant edge. It was the scent of vulnerability, of open spaces where one was exposed not just to the elements, but to the darker designs of fellow men. As Ilara and Brother Thomas emerged from the relative, though unwelcome, shelter of the barn, blinking in the nascent light, the vast expanse of the road stretched before them like a long, untamed beast. The previous night's cramped proximity, though unpleasant, had at least offered a shared misery, a collective if unspoken understanding of their plight. Now, the open road demanded a different kind of fortitude. The trees that lined the path, their branches still heavy with dew, seemed to lean in conspiratorially, their dense foliage a perfect cloak for lurking eyes. The silence, save for the chirping of early birds and the distant bleating of sheep, was not a comforting balm, but a pregnant pause, a moment of heightened awareness before the day's true hazards began. Ilara instinctively clutched the worn leather pouch containing her few coins. It was a meager hoard, painstakingly saved, intended for offerings at sacred sites and perhaps a warmer cloak should the journey extend into harsher climes. But to a brigand, it represented a significant gain, a quick and brutal profit for minimal effort. Her gaze, honed by a life lived close to the soil, darted from the road ahead to the dense undergrowth at its edges. Every shadow seemed to lengthen and twist, taking on the menacing shape of a man with a blade, every snapping twig a harbinger of an approaching threat. She remembered the hushed whispers exchanged around the sputtering lantern the night before, tales that had chilled her more than the barn's damp straw. Stories of travelers set upon, of their goods taken, and worse, of their spirits broken by the sheer, sudden violence of an ambush. Brother Thomas, ever the pragmatist, adjusted the grip on his sturdy oak staff. It was a simple tool, worn smooth by the miles, its purpose ostensibly to aid his weary feet over uneven terrain. But he knew, as did every soul who traveled these routes, that it could also serve as a weapon. A stout staff, wielded with knowledge and a desperate intent, could deter a lesser threat, could parry a glancing blow, could even, in extremis, deliver a bone-shattering strike. His faith was his primary shield, his prayers a constant quiet invocation for protection. Yet he was not naive. He understood the grim reality of human nature, the siren call of easy wealth that could drive men to unspeakable acts. He had seen the hardened faces of men who made their living by the road, their eyes holding a predatory gleam that spoke volumes of their trade. The very act of walking, once a simple, almost meditative rhythm, was now fraught with tension. Each step was measured, each glance a calculated assessment of potential danger. The communal spirit that might have offered some solace the previous night began to fray. Travelers who had shared a weary nod in the barn now kept to themselves, their bodies angled away from their companions, their eyes constantly scanning the perimeter. The shared vulnerability that had bound them in the enclosed space now seemed to amplify their isolation on the open road. Who could be trusted? Was the man walking a few paces ahead a fellow pilgrim or a scout for a band of ruffians? Was the seemingly innocuous cart lumbering towards them a merchant's transport or a clever ruse to lure the unwary closer? Suspicion became a second skin, a necessary adaptation to an environment where trust was a fatal luxury. Ilara found herself tensing whenever a horse's hooves echoed too loudly on the packed earth, or when a shadow moved with unnatural swiftness at the edge of her vision. She noticed how others reacted similarly, a quickening of pace, a subtle straightening of shoulders, a hand unconsciously reaching for a hidden knife or a rosary. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. Sleep, already a scarce commodity, became even more elusive, the mind perpetually on alert, incapable of truly resting. Every minor disturbance, a bird call, the rustle of leaves, the wind sighing through the trees, was interpreted through the lens of potential ambush. The imagination, left unchecked, painted vivid pictures of drawn swords, of desperate struggles, of the chilling finality of a bandit's strike. Brother Thomas observed this erosion of communal spirit with a heavy heart. He had hoped that shared faith and shared hardship would foster a sense of unity, a mutual support system. Instead, he saw the road's harsh lessons fostering distrust, turning fellow travelers into potential threats rather than allies. Each individual was a solitary unit, responsible for their own survival, their own vigilance. The easy camaraderie of a shared meal or a communal prayer felt distant, replaced by a guarded silence and a palpable sense of individual isolation. This pervasive fear, he knew, was as much a weapon as any blade wielded by a brigand. It weakened the resolve, divided the potential defenses, and made each traveler a more vulnerable target. The open road, in its stark beauty, was a cruel paradox. It offered the promise of freedom, of reaching sacred destinations, of experiencing the wider world. But for those without the protection of a well-armed retinue, it was also a hunting ground. The bandits and brigands, the highwaymen who made these routes their domain, were masters of their grim profession. They understood the rhythms of travel, the times when caravans were likely to be laden with goods, the stretches of road where cover was abundant and escape routes were plentiful. They preyed on the hope and the desperation of pilgrims, on the merchants carrying their wares, on any soul foolhardy enough to venture forth with visible wealth. Ilara recalled a story told by an older woman at the last market town, a tale of a wealthy merchant and his family who had been intercepted just a day's ride from their intended destination. The bandits, she'd said, had been swift and brutal, overwhelming the merchant's guards with sheer numbers and a ferocity born of desperation. The family's wagon, laden with bolts of fine cloth and intricately worked silver, had been emptied, and the merchant's wife and daughters, along with the man himself, had been left bound and half naked by the roadside, fortunate to have survived it all. The fear, the humiliation, the sheer terror of such an encounter, these were the unspoken specters that haunted every mile. The glint of steel was not merely a metaphor. On these roads, it was a reality. A flash of sunlight on a polished blade, the cold, hard gleam in a bandit's eye as he emerged from the trees, his face a mask of grim determination or cruel amusement. Such encounters were rarely polite negotiations. They were swift, brutal affairs, designed to instill terror and ensure compliance. The brigands understood that fear was their most potent ally. The mere sight of them, the sound of their harsh commands, was often enough to make even the stoutest heart falter. Brother Thomas had witnessed the aftermath of such encounters. He had stumbled upon the scene of a robbery once, finding a merchant's cart overturned, its contents scattered and rifled through, a pool of dark blood staining the earth near a discarded, broken shield. The driver and his companions were gone, presumably taken by the bandits or fled in terror, leaving their livelihood in ruins. The memory of the abandoned goods, the silent testament to a life's work violently interrupted, had stayed with him. It underscored the fragility of worldly possessions and the ever present threat that lay in wait for those who journeyed without adequate protection. The psychological impact was profound. The constant fear of being preyed upon bred a deep seated distrust of strangers. Every person encountered on the road was viewed with a degree of suspicion. Was that farmer tending his field truly concerned with his crops, or was he signaling the approach of travelers to a waiting band? Was that lone rider heading towards them a fellow pilgrim, or a scout for a larger group? This pervasive suspicion chipped away at any nascent sense of solidarity. It forced individuals to become islands unto themselves, their focus narrowed to their own immediate safety and the protection of their meager possessions. The communal spirit of pilgrimage, meant to foster spiritual growth and shared devotion, was under constant siege from the pragmatic, brutal reality of the road. Ilara found herself instinctively averting her gaze from those who seemed overly watchful or whose eyes lingered too long. She kept her voice low when speaking, her movements small and unobtrusive. She walked closer to the center of the road, away from the concealing shadows of the trees, even though that meant a greater exposure to anyone approaching from the front. These were small, almost subconscious adaptations, born of a primal instinct for self-preservation. The carefree spirit with which she might have once embarked on a journey was now tempered by a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every rustle in the undergrowth sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins, and the sound of a horse's gallop, even in the distance, could make her heart pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. Brother Thomas, too, felt the weight of this pervasive danger. He understood that his vows of poverty and his reliance on God's grace did not exempt him from the very real threats posed by those who lived outside the bounds of law and morality. He had learned to read the subtle signs of danger, the unusually quiet stretch of road, the nervous demeanor of a peasant working in a field, the sudden flight of birds from a copse of trees. These were all indicators that something was amiss, that the road might hold more than just dust and distance. His faith was his constant companion, but he knew that faith alone could not always deflect a well-aimed blow or a swift, brutal robbery. He carried his staff not as a symbol of his monastic order, but as a tool of survival, a practical measure against a very earthly peril. The consequences of encountering these predators were often severe, extending far beyond the loss of material possessions. For many, the psychological scarring of such an encounter was a burden they carried for the rest of their lives. The violation of their safety, the terror of facing death or grievous harm, could leave deep emotional wounds, fostering a cynicism and a fear that poisoned their outlook on the world. Even those who were fortunate enough to escape with only their goods stolen often found their faith tested, their sense of security shattered. How could they trust in a benevolent God when such rampant evil existed in his creation? How could they believe in the goodness of man when faced with such stark examples of cruelty and greed? The road became a crucible, testing not only physical endurance, but also the very resilience of the human spirit. Each traveler was forced to confront their own capacity for fear, their own ability to maintain hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. The brigands, in their predatory existence, inadvertently played a role in shaping the character of those who traveled their paths. They forced a heightened awareness, a sharpened perception, and a grim pragmatism upon all who dared to venture forth. The desire for spiritual fulfillment, the yearning for sacred sites, often had to contend with the more immediate, visceral need for survival. Ilara found herself constantly scanning the faces of her fellow travelers, searching for any sign that might betray their intentions. A furtive glance, a hushed conversation held just out of earshot, a hand that lingered too long on a concealed object. All these small details were amplified by the pervasive sense of danger. The camaraderie that might have blossomed in safer circumstances withered under the harsh sun of suspicion. Each person was a potential threat, a competitor for scarce resources, or worse, an informant for those who lay in wait. The road, which should have been a path of shared spiritual quest, had become a landscape of potential betrayal, forcing each pilgrim into a solitary struggle for safety. Brother Thomas, witnessing this, understood the true cost of banditry. It was not merely the theft of coin or goods, but the theft of trust, the corruption of good intentions, and the breeding of fear that poisoned the very air they breathed. The highwayman's shadow was long, stretching not just over the physical road, but over the minds and hearts of every traveler, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked at the edges of their illuminated path. It was a darkness that demanded vigilance, resilience, and a faith strong enough to pierce through the deepest shadows. The journey, he reflected, was not just about reaching the destination, but about enduring the trials of the passage, about navigating the treacherous terrain of both the external worlds and the internal landscape of one's own fear. The dawn, once a herald of hope, now brought with it the gnawing anticipation of yet another trial, one subtler, yet no less insidious than the shadowed threats of the road itself. While the specter of the highwayman, a creature of brute force and sudden violence, loomed large in every traveler's mind, a different breed of predator stalked the path. Those who offered respite, but at a price that bled a pilgrim's purse dry, leaving them not only poorer in coin, but also in spirit. These were the keepers of inns and the operators of ferries, men and women who saw not weary souls seeking solace, but opportunities for avarice, their hospitality a calculated transaction designed to extract the last copper from the desperate. Ilara, her stomach a hollow ache that echoed the anxieties of the night, felt a prickle of apprehension as they approached a cluster of buildings huddled beside a sluggish, wide river. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, promising warmth and sustenance, yet the sight did little to quell the unease that had settled deep within her. The inn, A sturdy, if somewhat dilapidated structure bore the weathered marks of countless travelers passing through. Its sign, a faded painting of a leaping stag, creaked mournfully in the gentle breeze, a sound that seemed to presage the disingenuous welcome awaiting them. Brother Thomas, ever observant, noted the cluster of men lounging near the entrance, their eyes following the approach of any new arrival with a practiced, assessing gaze that spoke not of camaraderie, but of calculation. The promise of a warm meal, a dry bed, and a moment's peace was a siren song that few travelers could resist, particularly after the rigors of a night spent exposed to the elements or the gnawing fear of brigands. Yet, the inns along these routes had learned to exploit this vulnerability with a cunning born of experience. What was advertised as a hearty stew might emerge as little more than watery gruel, the meat suspiciously sparse and tough, the vegetables wilted and tasteless. The bread, if it could be called such, was often stale, a mere vessel for the meager portions of rancid butter or ersatz cheese. And the cost? That was where the true artistry of their deception lay. Prices were inflated to extortionate levels, the cost of a single night's lodging and a meager meal often equaling a week's wages for a common laborer. As they entered the inn, the air, thick with the mingled scents of cheap ale, wood smoke, and unwashed bodies, did little to lift Alara's spirits. A burly man with a florid face and eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual gleam of self interest emerged from behind a rough hewn counter. He greeted them with a boisterousness that felt entirely manufactured, his smile too wide, his gestures too expansive. "Welcome, travelers, welcome," he boomed, his voice resonating through the common room. "A long road you've traveled, I'll wager. Come in, and leave your cares at the door. We have the finest fare this side of the river, and beds softer than a maiden's sigh." Ilara, her gaze fixed on the meager offerings on display, a few loaves of bread looking suspiciously hard, a pot of something dark and unappetizing bubbling over a low fire, felt her stomach clench. She approached the counter hesitantly, her hand instinctively going to the small leather pouch tucked securely within her tunic. The innkeeper's eyes followed her movement, a subtle shift in his posture betraying his keen interest in her possessions. "We seek a bit of sustenance, good sir," Brother Thomas said, his voice calm and measured, "and perhaps a safe place for the night, if your accommodations are as welcoming as your greeting." The innkeeper's smile did not falter, but his gaze sharpened. "Accommodations aplenty, holy man, and a meal that will put the spring back in your step. For you, a special price, seeing as you're on a sacred journey. A hearty portion of our famous bean stew, fresh baked bread, and a comfortable cot for the night. All for, hmm." He paused, stroking his chin, his eyes calculating. 5 silver pennies each. Ilara's breath hitched. 5 silver pennies. It was an astronomical sum, more than she had earned in a month of arduous labor at the market. She glanced at Brother Thomas, her eyes wide with disbelief. He, too, registered the outrageous demand, but his expression remained outwardly impassive, a testament to his practiced self-control. He knew that to protest too vehemently might only invite further exploitation, or worse, turn them away into the uncertain embrace of the open road once more. 5 pennies? Alara managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. For beans and bread? The innkeeper's smile widened, revealing a gap between his front teeth. Ah, but these are not just any beans, good lady. These are specially imported, plump and nourishing, and the bread, baked this very morning by my own wife, with the finest flour, and the cot, a true luxury, I assure you. He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. You wouldn't want to risk the road again tonight, would you? Not with what might be lurking in the shadows. Here, you are safe and well fed. Elara felt a wave of despair wash over her. Her meager savings, painstakingly collected for offerings at shrines, and perhaps a much needed warmer cloak for the coming chill, were suddenly vulnerable to this man's rapacious greed. She looked at her worn boots, at the threadbare fabric of her tunic, and then at the innkeeper's prosperous girth. He was clearly thriving on the desperation of travelers like herself, his comfort bought with the depletion of others. Brother Thomas, seeing her distress, stepped forward. We will take your stew, sir, but perhaps just one portion to share, and two cots, and we will pay what is fair. The innkeeper's smile flickered. Fair? Fair is what keeps a roof over your head and food on the table, my friend. And my price is my price. He gestured towards a small, dimly lit table in the corner where a solitary figure sat hunched over a plate. See that man? He came in earlier, needing a meal. He begged for just a bowl of broth. I gave him what he wanted, and he paid his way, as all must. Ilara's gaze followed the innkeeper's gesture. The man at the table was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his clothes ragged. He was indeed picking at a bowl of thin, unappetizing broth, his movements slow and listless. As Ilara watched, the innkeeper sauntered over to the man's table and leaned down, speaking in a low, guttural tone. The man flinched, then reached into a pouch at his belt and reluctantly handed over a few coins. The innkeeper snatched them, his expression triumphant, and then turned back to Ilara and Brother Thomas. He paid his due, the innkeeper said, a smug satisfaction in his voice, and he'll have to be content with what little he can afford. You, however, have the means to enjoy a proper meal, and for that you pay the proper price. He then reached into a small sack and pulled out a handful of dried beans, tossing them onto the counter. That will be 3 silver pennies for this, he declared, gesturing to the meager portion, enough to fill your belly for a few hours. Ilara felt a surge of indignation, quickly followed by a sickening realization of her helplessness. 3 silver pennies for a handful of dried beans. It was daylight robbery, pure and simple. But what choice did she have? To refuse would mean facing the night hungry and exposed, a risk she was not yet willing to take. With trembling fingers, she unfastened her pouch and carefully counted out the coins, her heart aching with each one she surrendered. The innkeeper snatched them greedily, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. As Alara sat down at the rough table, the small pile of beans before her felt like a cruel mockery. They were hard, dry, and offered little promise of true sustenance. She looked at Brother Thomas, who had also been forced to part with his own hard-earned coins for a similar meager offering. His usual serene expression was clouded with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. He had witnessed firsthand the exploitation of the vulnerable, the way in which faith and need could be preyed upon by those who profited from the suffering of others. Later, As they prepared to retire to their promised cots, Ilara noticed a young man, no older than herself, being led to a corner of the common room where a few straw filled sacks lay scattered on the floor. He had been traveling with a small family, a wife and two children, their faces etched with weariness. The innkeeper had apparently demanded a higher price from him, claiming his wife and children would need additional bedding and perhaps a separate, more secluded space. The young man, his voice cracking with desperation, had pleaded that he had only enough for himself. Brother Thomas, his concern palpable, watched as the innkeeper, with a gruff shove, directed the young man to his designated spot. Then the innkeeper approached the family, his voice now laced with a false sympathy. A shame, a real shame, he murmured to the young wife, who clutched her children close. Your husband seems to have fallen short. Perhaps, if you were to offer a little extra, I could ensure you all a more comfortable night. A few extra pence, perhaps? Or that pretty brooch you're wearing. The young wife's face crumpled. She was forced to surrender a small, tarnished silver brooch, a treasured memento from her own mother, in exchange for the innkeeper's promise of a slightly less miserable night. Brother Thomas, witnessing this quiet act of desperation and the innkeeper's callousness, felt a surge of righteous anger, yet he knew that direct confrontation was unlikely to yield any positive result. The innkeeper held all the cards, his establishment a sanctuary from the road's dangers, but also a trap for the unwary. The experience left Ilara with a profound sense of disillusionment. The road, with its overt dangers, had at least been honest in its threat. This, this insidious form of exploitation, felt like a betrayal of the very concept of hospitality, a perversion of the Good Samaritan's calling. The innkeeper, like the bandits, preyed on the vulnerable, but his methods were cloaked in the guise of service, his avarice hidden behind a veneer of welcoming smiles and promises of comfort. The silver pennies she had handed over felt like a sacrifice not to a deity, but to a secular demon, a tribute to a system that profited from the weariness and desperation of those seeking solace. Brother Thomas, as they made their way to the uncomfortable cots, spoke softly, his voice filled with a weary understanding. The road teaches many lessons, Ilara, he said, his gaze fixed on the dimly lit room. Some are of courage and resilience, of facing the external dangers with a steadfast heart. Others are of the human spirit, of the temptations that lie within, the greed that can fester even in the hearts of men who offer shelter. We must be vigilant, not just against the brigand's blade, but against the subtle bartering of compassion, against the commodification of kindness. Ilara nodded, the handful of dried beans a bitter taste in her mouth, a stark reminder of the day's harsh lesson. The innkeepers and ferrymen, in their own way, were as much a trial of the road as any ambushing ruffian. They offered a service, yes, but at a price that stripped away not just coin, but also a measure of the traveler's hope, leaving them further depleted, their faith tested by the unvarnished avarice they encountered in their journey. The quest for spiritual enlightenment was often forced to contend with the stark reality of economic exploitation, a humbling reminder that even the paths to salvation could be paved with the stones of human greed. The promise of warmth and rest had been delivered, but the cost was a heavy one, a drain on resources and a stain on the spirit, leaving travelers like Ilara and Brother Thomas with a deeper understanding of the multifaceted trials that awaited them on the arduous journey ahead. The innkeeper's profit was built on the foundation of their depletion, a stark illustration of how even sanctuary could become a source of suffering. The gnawing in Alara's stomach was no longer solely from hunger. It had taken root deeper, a cold, persistent ache that mirrored the chilling questions blossoming in her mind. The arduous miles had worn down not just the soles of her boots, but the very fabric of her conviction. The fervor that had propelled her from her familiar life, the unwavering belief that each step was witnessed and accounted for by a benevolent God, was beginning to fray. The relentless cycle of hardship, the meager meals, the exposed nights, the calculated cruelty of men like the innkeeper had begun to whisper insidious doubts into the chambers of her heart. Was this suffering truly seen? Was it a test of her faith, a crucible designed to refine her spirit? Or was she merely a solitary fool, chasing a celestial illusion across a world indifferent to her plight? The sun, which had once seemed a divine spotlight, illuminating her righteous path, now felt like a harsh, unblinking eye, observing her struggles with an unnerving detachment. She remembered the comforting certainty of her village priest, his words a balm to any nascent fear. Now, such solace felt a world away, replaced by the stark, unvarnished reality of her journey. Brother Thomas, too, felt the insidious creep of doubt, though his battles were waged on different fronts. He had always found strength in the spiritual discipline of his order, in the structured prayers and communal devotions that formed the bedrock of his life. But the road offered no such consolations. Instead, it presented him with a parade of contradictions, a stark display of human fallibility that chipped away at his idealism. He had encountered pilgrims who spoke of their arduous journey with a fervent piety, yet whose words were peppered with boastful confessions of minor sins, as if seeking absolution not from God, but from their fellow travelers, as if their very participation in suffering conferred a certain spiritual prestige. Then there were the merchants, men whose souls seemed as coated in grime as their wares, who hawked indulgences with the same slickness they used to sell their wares, promising heavenly favor for a price, a transactional approach to salvation that struck him as profoundly blasphemous. He witnessed their pious pronouncements juxtaposed with their avaricious dealings, the holy symbols adorning their stalls seeming to mock the very faith they purported to uphold. These encounters left him with a bitter taste, a profound weariness not just of the body, but of the spirit. The hypocrisy he witnessed felt like a corrosive agent, eroding the foundations of his own faith, making him question the very nature of piety in a world so readily swayed by material gain. The physical exhaustion was a constant companion, an insistent drain on their reserves, but it was the spiritual fatigue that truly began to weigh them down. Each setback, each unmet expectation felt like a confirmation of some unseen flaw within themselves, a subtle hint that perhaps they were not worthy of divine favor, or worse, that divine favor was simply not a tangible force in their lives. Ilara found herself replaying moments of past weakness, trivial transgressions that had once seemed inconsequential, now amplified in her mind into proof of her unworthiness. Had she been too quick to anger when the innkeeper had cheated them? Had her despair at the sight of the young mother's brooch been a lapse in faith? These internal interrogations were more exhausting than any physical exertion. The desire for divine solace, which had been the driving force of her pilgrimage, now seemed an elusive phantom, a goal that receded with every weary step. Brother Thomas, Ilara murmured one evening, her voice thin and reedy as they rested beside a gnarled oak, the embers of their meager fire casting flickering shadows on their faces. Do you ever do you ever wonder if we are truly seen? If any of this struggle matters in the grand design? Her gaze was fixed on the vast, indifferent expanse of the night sky, the stars like distant, cold embers. Brother Thomas sighed, a sound of profound weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He had been grappling with similar thoughts, the eloquent pronouncements of theology, offering little comfort against the stark reality of their present circumstances. The path of the faithful is often shrouded in mystery, Ilara, he replied, his voice gentle but lacking its usual resonant conviction. We are taught that God's ways are not our ways, and that trials are meant to strengthen our resolve, to purify our souls. He paused, then added with a heavy heart, yet there are moments when the silence of the heavens feels deafening, when the weight of the world presses down with such force that even faith can falter. He recalled a recent encounter with a group of fellow pilgrims, their faces etched with a piety that bordered on self-flagellation. They spoke of fasting, of self-inflicted penance, of a fervent desire to suffer for their sins, but their fervor was laced with a strange triumphalism, a competitive spirit that seemed to elevate suffering itself into a virtue. They spoke of their privations with a kind of pride, as if their very misery was a testament to their spiritual superiority. Brother Thomas found himself repelled by this subtle arrogance, this perversion of humility. Was this what true devotion looked like? Or was it another form of ego, masked in the guise of religious zeal? The erosion of faith was a slow, insidious process, like water wearing away stone. It was not a sudden abandonment, but a gradual dimming, a creeping disillusionment that settled over the spirit like a shroud. Ilara found herself increasingly preoccupied with the practicalities of survival, the gnawing hunger, the gnawing cold, the gnawing fear of what the next day might bring. The grand spiritual quest felt distant, almost irrelevant, when faced with the immediate, tangible miseries of their existence. She looked at Brother Thomas, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with a weariness that went beyond mere physical fatigue, and saw her own inner turmoil reflected there. We see men who call themselves holy, Brother Thomas continued, his gaze drifting towards the dying embers. Men who preach of detachment from worldly goods, yet whose hands are forever outstretched for coin, whose pronouncements are shaped by the weight of the purse. We see those who claim to seek divine truth, yet whose words are filled with judgment and condemnation for those who do not follow their precise path. The very air seems thick with a kind of spiritual rot, a perversion of the sacred. He ran a hand over his rough, homespun robe, a gesture that seemed to express a deep weariness with the world as he knew it. It makes one question, not the existence of God, perhaps, but the sincerity of man's devotion and the very efficacy of our endeavors when they are so often corrupted by the baser instincts. The relentless nature of their adversity had begun to strip away the veneer of spiritual certainty, exposing the raw, vulnerable core of their humanity. Ilara felt a profound sense of loneliness, even in the presence of Brother Thomas. His quiet struggles mirrored her own, but the shared burden did little to alleviate the personal despair. She was alone with her doubts, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, her faith no longer a sturdy ship, but a fragile raft tossed about by the relentless waves of hardship. She remembered the simple faith of her childhood, the unquestioning belief that had once sustained her. Now, that innocence seemed like a distant, unattainable dream. Perhaps, Ilara ventured, her voice barely a whisper. Perhaps the true test is not in enduring the hardships, but in finding meaning within them, even when the divine seems absent. Perhaps the suffering itself is not the point, but what we choose to do with it. It was a fragile thought, a tentative reach for understanding in the encroaching darkness. Brother Thomas nodded slowly, a flicker of something akin to hope rekindling in his weary eyes. You speak wisdom, Ilara. The road offers its lessons in harsh ways. It strips away illusions, revealing the true nature of things, both within ourselves and in the world around us. It forces us to confront the darkness, both external and internal, and to find a way to carry on, even when the light seems to have fled. He looked at her, his gaze steady and compassionate. The journey may lead us through valleys of despair, but it is in those valleys that we often find the strength to climb again. Our faith may be tested, but perhaps it is in that very testing that it is truly forged. The introspection brought on by exhaustion and the constant struggle for survival was a double-edged sword. It forced them to confront their own limitations, their fears, their burgeoning doubts. But it also offered the possibility of a deeper understanding, a more resilient form of faith, one that was not dependent on outward signs or easy assurances, but that was rooted in the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The weight of their trials was undeniable, but within that weight, they were beginning to discover a nascent strength, a hard-won wisdom that would serve them as they continued their arduous path. The journey was far from over, and the shadows of doubt would undoubtedly lengthen, but in their shared vulnerability and their quiet determination, a different kind of light was beginning to emerge, one born not of divine revelation, but of the enduring human capacity to persevere. The stark reality of the road was that it offered no guarantees, only the promise of a destination that might never be reached. For Ilara, and for countless others who embarked on such arduous journeys, the final destination was not merely a geographical point on a map, but the celestial city, the heavenly Jerusalem. The medieval mind grappled with a profound paradox concerning death on pilgrimage. While the journey was undertaken to seek spiritual merit, healing, or divine favor, the ultimate cessation of life while en route was not always perceived as a tragic failure. Instead, it could be viewed as the ultimate act of devotion, a consecration of the pilgrimage itself. Imagine, if you will, a pilgrim, perhaps a young woman like Ilara, or a weathered man whose life had been marked by hardship, struck down by a fever that burned hotter than any summer sun, lying on a rough pallet in a humble hospice, or even beneath the indifferent sky, their breathing shallow, their strength failing, their world reduced to the flickering light of their own ebbing life. In such a moment, the arduous miles already traveled, the prayers whispered, the sacrifices made, would not be in vain. The very act of perishing in the pursuit of a holy goal, with a prayer on their lips and faith in their heart, could be interpreted as a completed spiritual quest. Their earthly journey had ended, yes, but their eternal one had, in that very instant, potentially reached its triumphant culmination. The gates of heaven, rather than a distant shrine, might have swung open before them, their earthly pilgrimage transformed into a direct, unmediated ascension. This was not a morbid fascination with death, but a deeply ingrained aspect of medieval piety. The lives of many saints were punctuated by tales of their martyrdom or their passing while undertaking great spiritual works. Their suffering and their ultimate demise were seen not as defeats, but as powerful testaments to their unwavering faith. The pilgrim who succumbed to illness or accident on the road to Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome was in essence emulating these holy figures. Their earthly form might have been consumed by the harshness of the journey, but their spirit, it was believed, was welcomed into the divine presence. The journey itself, even if cut short, was the offering. Their life, laid down on the path of faith, was the ultimate sacrifice, a testament to a devotion that transcended the limitations of the mortal coil. Consider the story, perhaps whispered around campfires or recounted in solemn monastic halls, of a pilgrim who, upon realizing their strength had finally left them, looked not with despair at the missed destination, but with a serene acceptance towards the heavens. They might have confessed their sins one last time, not to a priest, but directly to God, their faith their only confessor. They might have entrusted their loved ones, their unfinished earthly business, to divine care, their sole focus on the spiritual reward that awaited them. In this context, their death was not a failure to reach the shrine, but a successful arrival at the throne of God. The earthly shrine, with its relics and rituals, was but a symbol. The true destination was eternal communion. This perspective added a layer of grim irony to the pilgrim's experience. The very hardships that threatened to break them, the hunger, the colds, the disease, could paradoxically become the instruments of their ultimate salvation. The fever that weakened their body might be seen as a purifying fire, burning away impurities and preparing their soul for ascension. The exhaustion that led to their final breath could be interpreted as the exhaustion of earthly burdens, the shedding of mortal coils. It was a testament to a worldview where the spiritual realm held ultimate sway, where the physical journey was but a prelude to a far grander, eternal voyage. Ilara, in her moments of deepest despair, might have found a strange solace in this understanding. If the worst were to happen, if the road proved too much, her passing would not be a lonely, forgotten end. It would be a martyrdom of sorts, a completion of her divine commission. The thought, though tinged with the cold reality of her vulnerability, offered a counterpoint to the gnawing fear of insignificance. If her life was to be forfeit on this path, it would at least be forfeit in service, in a quest that was deemed worthy of such a sacrifice. The stories of those who had perished, their journeys ending prematurely, but their souls, it was hoped, finding eternal peace, were woven into the very fabric of pilgrimage lore. They served as cautionary tales, of course, reminders of the dangers, but also as narratives of ultimate victory. Their unfinished earthly journeys were the fuel for a completed heavenly one. The subtle nuances of this belief were not lost on those who undertook such journeys. It was a complex tapestry of hope, faith, and a profound acceptance of mortality. The pilgrim who died on the road was not a failure, they were a testament. Their broken body was a testament to their commitment, their final breath a testament to their enduring faith. The very act of dying in the pursuit of God was, in itself, a form of worship, a living sacrifice that resonated with the deeper theological currents of the era. The pilgrim's path was fraught with peril, a crucible that tested not only their physical endurance, but the very foundations of their faith. Yet, within this crucible, a profound paradox emerged: the possibility of achieving the ultimate spiritual goal not by reaching the earthly destination, but by embracing the journey's end and death. This was the grim irony, the poignant truth that for many medieval pilgrims, their journey's end was not a place, but a state of being, a direct passage to the divine, achieved through the ultimate sacrifice of life itself. Their lives, laid down on the path, became a testament to a faith that saw even in death a triumph. The road, in its unforgiving nature, could paradoxically lead not to a shrine, but to salvation itself, a destination reached not by foot, but by spirit. The air, once thin and sharp with the promise of holy purpose, now grew thick and cloying with the scent of beeswax, cheap incense, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. Ilara found herself caught in a human tide, a swirling eddy of pilgrims and locals alike, all pressing towards the great stone edifice of the shrine. Yet, the reverence she had anticipated, the hushed awe of a place touched by the divine, was drowned out by a cacophony of hawkers' cries and the relentless thrum of commerce. This was not merely a place of prayer, it was a marketplace, a nexus where the sacred and the secular collided with a jarring, almost vulgar intensity. Stalls, crudely fashioned from rough-hewn timber and draped with vibrant, if somewhat grubby cloths, lined the approach to the shrine. They overflowed with an astonishing array of goods, each item imbued, or at least claimed to be imbued, with the spiritual potency of the saint whose tomb lay within. Ilara's eyes, accustomed to the stark simplicity of the road, were overwhelmed by the sheer volume and variety. She saw rows of tiny cast metal medals depicting the saint in various poses, healing, interceding, even performing miracles. Beside them lay rosaries fashioned from polished wood, carved bone, and sometimes, she suspected, the teeth of unknown beasts. Small vials, stoppered with wax, promised to contain holy water, blessed oil, or even the dust scraped from the saint's tombstone. The sellers themselves were a motley crew. Many were local townsfolk, their faces etched with the familiarity of those who lived by the ebb and flow of pilgrim traffic. They shouted their wares with practiced ease, their voices hoarse from hours of persistent entreaty. "A medal for protection, good lady," one man bellowed, thrusting a tarnished silver disc towards Ilara. "Blessed by the saint himself, guaranteed to ward off ill fortune." Another, a woman with shrewd eyes and a gap-toothed smile, held up a string of amber beads. "From the Holy Land these are, pilgrim. feel the warmth of the sun of Zion within them. But it was the presence of the monks, often in their distinctive habits, that truly highlighted the commercial undercurrent of the shrine. They were not merely present to offer spiritual guidance, they were astute businessmen, deeply involved in the trade of salvation itself. Here, in the shadow of the sacred, they offered indulgences, official dispensations from penance, granted in exchange for a generous donation. These were not furtive transactions, they were announced with almost theatrical flourish. A robed figure, standing on a small raised platform near the shrine's entrance, would boom out pronouncements, his voice amplified by the surrounding stone. Behold, the grace of God bestowed through his faithful servant. Saint insert saint's name here, he'd proclaim, his eyes scanning the gathered throng, searching for eager faces and open purses. For a mere 50 pence, receive absolution for 7 years of venial sins. For 100 pence, a full indulgence upon your passing, ensuring your swift journey through purgatory to the eternal embrace of heaven. The coins, delivered with a mixture of fervent faith and pragmatic necessity, would then disappear into coffers, their clinking a subtle counterpoint to the solemn pronouncements. Ilara watched, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. She had undertaken this pilgrimage with a heart full of hope, seeking solace and spiritual renewal. But the scene before her was a stark reminder that even the most sacred aspirations could be commodified. The promise of eternal salvation was being hawked alongside cheap trinkets and questionable relics. It felt wrong. The very act of veneration, the deep personal quest for divine connection, was being diluted, overshadowed by the clamor of trade. She saw a woman, her face gaunt and drawn, her clothes threadbare, clutching a small, crudely carved wooden cross. She approached a monk, offering him a few worn copper coins, her eyes pleading. The monk, his expression one of practiced piety, accepted the offering, and then with a flourish pressed a small printed parchment into her hand. It was an indulgence, a piece of paper promising spiritual favor. Ilara wondered what burdens that woman carried, what sins she sought to expiate with her meager savings. The transaction, so ordinary in its setting, felt profoundly unsettling. Nearby, a different kind of suffering was on display, an even starker illustration of the human condition against the backdrop of commercial fervor. In the shadows of the shrine's walls, huddled against the cold stone, were the beggars. Some were old, their bodies twisted by age and infirmity, their hands outstretched in a perpetual gesture of supplication. Others were younger, but bore the telltale signs of disease, hacking coughs, leprous sores, vacant eyes that spoke of profound suffering. They were the stark, unvarnished reality that the shiny medals and blessed trinkets sought to obscure. One young boy, no older than 10, sat propped against a pillar, his legs withered and useless, his voice, thin and reedy, barely carried above the din. For the love of God, a penny for a starving orphan, he croaked, his gaze fixed on the ground. Pilgrims, laden with their purchased spiritual assurances, would often hurry past, their eyes averted, unwilling to confront this abject poverty, or perhaps believing that their indulgences had already absolved them of any charitable obligation. Ilara felt a pang of guilt. Her own purse, though not overflowing, contained more than enough to purchase a small token. but her gaze kept returning to the boy, to the frail woman with the wooden cross, to the lepers huddled in the periphery. The commercialization of salvation, she realized, was not merely an abstract concept. It had tangible consequences, creating a stark divide between those who could afford spiritual security and those who were left to languish in earthly desperation. She saw a merchant, his robes finer than most, proudly displaying a small, glass encased fragment. A piece of the true cross, he announced, his voice booming with conviction, sealed with the bishop's own wax, a blessing beyond measure for a modest price. Ilara peered closer. The fragment was minuscule, a sliver of wood barely visible within the glass. Yet, the merchant's pronouncements drew a crowd, and a woman with a jeweled headdress pushed forward, her hand already reaching for her coin purse. The veneration of relics, a cornerstone of pilgrimage, was here reduced to a transaction, the sacred made into a commodity. The monks, in their pursuit of alms for the upkeep of the shrine, a worthy cause, no doubt, seemed to be actively encouraging this mindset. They spoke of the saint's intercession not as a matter of humble prayer and devotion, but as a currency that could be bought. Your offering ensures the saint's favor, one monk told a group of wealthy merchants, his tone smooth and persuasive. A generous donation here will ensure a prosperous venture, a safe journey, a healthy family. The spiritual quest, which had driven Alara for weeks, now felt entangled with a web of earthly desires and economic exchanges. She found herself examining a stall that sold small clay figures shaped in the likeness of the saint. They were crudely made, some even chipped or cracked, but they were selling briskly. Beside them lay small scrolls, purportedly containing prayers that, when recited with the figure, would invoke the saint's protection. It was a packaged form of devotion, designed for ease and accessibility, but it also felt like a dilution of genuine faith. Was it enough to simply buy a trinket and recite a prescribed prayer? Or was the true essence of pilgrimage in the internal journey, the struggle, the personal connection with the divine? The contrast between the spiritual aspirations of the pilgrims and the naked commercialism was jarring. People who had endured hardship, hunger, and the constant threat of illness on the road were now being asked to spend their last coin on a small piece of cloth purportedly worn by the saint, or a vial of water blessed by a distant, unseen priest. It was a system that preyed on hope, on fear, and on the deep-seated desire for divine favor. Ilara noticed a group of pilgrims gathered around a particularly animated stall owner. He was holding aloft a small tarnished silver spoon. "This spoon," he declared, his voice rising above the din, "was used by the saint himself to stir his medicinal broth. Anyone suffering from wasting sickness, from the pox, from any ailment of the humors, will find relief if they drink from this spoon." He then proceeded to detail the price, a sum that seemed exorbitant to Ilara, considering the spoon's rather unremarkable appearance. The desperation in the eyes of the pilgrims who were listening intently was palpable. They were not just seeking spiritual merit, they were seeking tangible cures, and they were willing to pay for the promise of them, however outlandish. The system was insidious. It played upon the deepest human needs and anxieties. For the sick, it offered hope of healing. For the fearful, it offered protection. For the devout, it offered a tangible link to the divine. And for the sellers, it offered profit. The monks, while ostensibly custodians of the sacred, were enmeshed in this economic machinery, their livelihoods, and the upkeep of their institutions, inextricably linked to the successful sale of spiritual commodities. She observed a family who had clearly spent a considerable portion of their savings. They carried several small bags filled with medals, blessed candles, and miniature icons. The father looked weary but relieved, as if a great burden had been lifted. But the mother's face was a mixture of pride and anxiety, her eyes darting towards the huddled beggars with a flicker of unease. Had their purchases truly secured them divine favor, or had they simply been relieved of their money, leaving them perhaps even more vulnerable than before? The very act of veneration had become intertwined with economic transaction. One did not simply pray at the shrine. One purchased the means to ensure that prayer was heard. The relics were not merely objects of reverence, they were marketable goods. The indulgences were not merely expressions of faith, they were contractual agreements for spiritual benefit. It was a world where salvation itself seemed to have a price tag. Ilara finally reached the inner sanctum, the place where the saint's relics were displayed. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and the light was dim, filtered through stained glass windows. Pilgrims knelt, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. Yet even here, the commercial aspect was not entirely absent. A discreet collection box sat near the reliquary, and monks moved amongst the kneeling faithful, offering whispered blessings and reminders of the importance of a grateful offering. She knelt before the reliquary, her hands clasped. The object of her long and arduous journey lay before her, a tangible symbol of her faith. But the experience of the marketplace, the hawker's cries, the monk's pronouncements, the presence of the beggars, it all lingered. It was a complex reality, a blend of genuine piety and pragmatic commerce, where the path to spiritual salvation was often paved with earthly transactions. The spoils of the road, it seemed, were not just the memories and the spiritual growth, but also the countless objects exchanged, bought, and sold in the shadow of the sacred. The pilgrimage, in its final stages, had revealed itself not just as a spiritual quest, but as a vibrant, sometimes unsettling economic enterprise. The faithful sought to honor God, but in doing so, they also fed the earthly institutions that housed his saints and the people who depended on them. It was a delicate, often uneasy balance. The air, thick with the murmur of prayers and the clink of coins, often concealed a subtler, more pervasive hum, the murmur of fabrication. While the faithful approached the relics with hearts brimming with genuine belief, the custodians of these sacred fragments, the monks and the mendicant friars, often found themselves navigating a delicate tightrope between devotion and deception. The allure of a saint's bone, a sliver of cloth worn in their earthly life, or a drop of their miraculously preserved blood was immense. But the more these sacred objects were sought, the greater the temptation to enhance their provenance, to embellish their histories, and in some instances, to outright invent their existence. Brother Thomas, a man whose piety was matched only by his keen observation, often found himself privy to these behind the scenes machinations. He had come to the shrine of St. Alaric not for the grand pronouncements or the bustling market, but for the quiet contemplation of faith. Yet, the more he lingered, the more he noticed the subtle currents of commerce that ran beneath the surface of spiritual devotion. He had seen pilgrims spend their last groats on metals that promised intercession, and he had witnessed monks, their faces serene, collect these offerings with practiced gratitude. But it was in the hushed conversations, the hushed exchanges between the custodians of the sacred, that the true nature of this enterprise began to reveal itself. One evening, seeking a quiet corner to transcribe his thoughts, Brother Thomas found himself lingering near the scriptorium, a place usually abuzz with the scratch of quills and the scent of ink. Tonight, however, the door was ajar, and the voices within were low, conspiratorial. He recognized the deep baritone of Brother Bernard, the keeper of St. Alaric's primary relics, a man known for his persuasive sermons and his uncanny ability to draw ever larger donations. With him was Brother Marcus, a younger monk, his face alight with an eager, almost feverish energy. And so, when the emperor himself pleaded for Alaric's intercession, the saint, in his infinite mercy, appeared to him in a dream. Brother Bernard was saying, his voice a silken thread weaving a tale of divine intervention. He guided the emperor to a hidden spring, whose waters would heal his ailing queen. Brother Thomas's brow furrowed. He had studied the chronicles of St. Alaric extensively. The saint's life, while undoubtedly filled with pious deeds and quiet acts of charity, was not marked by such grand, public displays of miraculous intervention, particularly not involving emperors and their queens. St. Alaric was known for his humility, his dedication to the poor, and his unwavering commitment to the monastic rule. But Brother Bernard, Brother Marcus interjected, his voice tinged with a slight hesitation. The chronicles speak of Alaric spending his final years in isolation, tending to his herb garden. There is no mention of him appearing to emperors or healing royalty. Brother Bernard let out a low chuckle, a sound that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. "Ah, young Marcus," he said, his voice softening with a condescending affection. "The chronicles are merely the bones of the story. It is we, the keepers of his memory, who must give them flesh, who must breathe life into them, so that the faithful may be inspired. Do you think the emperor's coffers would have been as generous had the story been of a humble monk tending his garden? The faithful need grand visions, dramatic encounters, tangible proof of the saint's power, reaching even the highest echelons of earthly authority. This tale of the emperor's queen, it adds a certain luster, does it not? It elevates Alaric from a mere saint to a patron of royalty, a confidant of kings, and when they hear such tales, they feel closer to him, their prayers more potent, their offerings more heartfelt." Brother Marcus was silent for a moment, wrestling with the implications. But is it not a form of deception? He finally ventured, his gaze fixed on the worn wooden table between them. Brother Bernard leaned forward, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Deception, Marcus, is a harsh word. I prefer to call it artistic embellishment. We are not lying. We are merely presenting the truth in its most potent, most inspiring form. Think of the good it does, the faith it strengthens, the donations it brings, which then allow us to maintain this holy place, to care for the poor, to continue the sacred work of God. Is it not worth a little embellishment to ensure the continuation of such vital endeavors?" He picked up a small, worn leather pouch, its drawstring frayed. Consider this, he continued, pulling out a small, tarnished silver crucifix. This, they say, was Alaric's personal crucifix, the one he clasped in his final moments. A beautiful story, is it not? But the truth is, it was found in a dusty chest in the cellar, probably belonging to some long forgotten brother. Yet, look at how the pilgrims flock to it. They touch it, they kiss it, they offer their pence for a blessing from its touch. And why? Because the story imbues it with power. Without the story, it is merely a piece of tarnished metal. With it, it is a conduit to the divine. Brother Marcus seemed unconvinced, but if the relic itself is not what we claim, or if the story is untrue, are we not leading the faithful astray? Misled? Brother Bernard scoffed, though his tone remained outwardly gentle. They are led to greater devotion, Marcus. They are led to believe in the power of faith, the intercession of the saints, and in their belief, they find solace, comfort, and hope. That is never a misdirection. The physical object, the precise historical detail, these are secondary. What matters is the faith it inspires, the spiritual journey it facilitates. And if a little creative storytelling helps that journey, then we are not deceivers, we are enablers of grace. He then spoke of other subtle manipulations, the practice of moving relics. A saint might have a primary arm bone enshrined here, but a secondary finger bone might be discovered, or a tertiary fragment of cloth from his habit at another less frequented shrine managed by a friendly abbey. This created a network of associated holy sites, each drawing pilgrims and their coin, all bolstering the cult of the saint. It was a form of religious marketing, a strategic dissemination of sacred material to maximize spiritual and financial return. Brother Bernard went on to explain how some abbeys would deliberately hoard lesser relics, perhaps a simple wooden comb or a well-worn sandal, and then, during lean times, discover them. These would be presented as the saint's personal effects, imbued with his essence, and sold at a premium. The stories attached to them were crafted with care. The comb, for instance, might have been the very one Alaric used to untangle his hair while meditating on the scriptures, a tangible link to his most profound spiritual moments. The sandal might have been worn on his journey to convert a particularly stubborn pagan village, a testament to his tireless evangelism. Each item, however mundane in itself, was woven into a narrative that amplified its spiritual significance and consequently its market value. The key, my young friend, Bernard concluded, patting Marcus on the shoulder, is to always maintain an aura of mystery and unquestionable sanctity. Never let the common folk see the seams of the tapestry. Let them see only the glorious, divine picture. And remember, the more elaborate the tale, the more compelling the relic, the more generous the pilgrimage. We are, in essence, merchants of faith, and our wares are miracles. Brother Thomas, hidden in the shadows, felt a profound unease settle over him. He had always believed in the power of relics, in the tangible connection they offered to the lives of the saints. He had seen their power to comfort, to inspire, and to draw people closer to God. But he had never considered that this power might be in part manufactured. He had heard of relics being used to bolster a monastery's prestige, but the calculated manipulation of faith for financial gain, the conscious blurring of truth and fabrication, was a different matter entirely. The next day, Brother Thomas observed Brother Bernard in action. A group of wealthy merchants, their faces flushed with the recent success of a trading venture, approached the shrine of Saint Alaric. Brother Bernard, his face a mask of humble piety, greeted them with open arms. He led them to a small, velvet draped pedestal upon which rested a small, intricately carved wooden bird. This, my esteemed patrons, Brother Bernard announced, his voice resonating with paternal warmth, is the very sparrow that St. Alaric nursed back to health after it fell from its nest. He would often speak to it, sharing his prayers and his wisdom. It is said that anyone who holds this bird and whispers their hopes into its wooden heart will find their aspirations carried to the heavens as if on the wings of a divine messenger. The merchants crowded around, their eyes wide with awe. One of them, a portly man with a gilded chain around his neck, reached out and gently touched the bird. He then produced a heavy purse, its contents undoubtedly significant, and presented it to Brother Bernard. As the coin rattled into the monastery's coffers, Brother Bernard beamed, his smile radiating what appeared to be genuine gratitude for the pilgrim's devotion, but which Thomas now recognized as the satisfaction of a successful sale. Later, Thomas saw Brother Marcus examining another relic, a small vial containing what was purported to be the saint's tears of repentance. The vial was stoppered with a wax seal bearing the abbey's crest. The tears shed by Saint Alaric during his 40 days of fasting in the desert, Bernard had declared to a group of anxious women, a potent balm for any soul troubled by doubt or despair. Marcus, however, was not admiring the vial. He was carefully scraping a tiny speck of the dried substance from the rim with a sharp needle. He then looked at the vial, then at the needle, a troubled expression on his face. Thomas, his heart heavy, knew what Marcus was likely doing. He was probably testing its authenticity, perhaps with a drop of water, or examining it under a magnifying lens. Was it merely dried sap from a local tree, molded it into a semblance of authenticity? Or was it, by some miraculous chance, truly the crystallized sorrow of a saint? The truth, Thomas suspected, was likely far more mundane and far more profitable. The practice extended beyond individual relics. The very narratives of the saints were subject to revision. If a saint's life was too quiet, too uneventful, it was amplified. Miracles were added, prophecies were invented, and connections to significant historical events were forged. This was not merely to inspire faith, it was also a crucial element of inter-abbey competition. If Abbey A possessed a saint with a dramatic, well-documented history of miracles, Abbey B, with a saint whose exploits were more understated, had to find ways to compete. This often involved discovering new evidence, reinterpreting old texts, or as Brother Bernard subtly suggested, creating entirely new narratives. Brother Thomas, in his quiet study of the past, began to see a pattern. The relics that attracted the most pilgrims, and consequently the most donations, were not necessarily those with the strongest historical provenance. They were those with the most compelling stories, the most dramatic accounts of divine intervention, the most tangible links to the saint's earthly life. And these stories, he now understood, were often carefully crafted, polished, and marketed by monks like Brother Bernard. He remembered a particular instance, a pilgrimage to the shrine of Saint Benedict the Humble, known for his austere lifestyle and his devotion to prayer. The shrine was modest, the relics few, yet a rival abbey, claiming to possess a sliver of Saint Benedict's own monastic tunic, had recently seen a surge in visitors. The tunic, it was whispered, had miraculously retained the saint's scent, a faint aroma of lavender and incense, a testament to his unblemished purity. Thomas had visited that rival abbey, and while the scent was indeed present, it was to his nose indistinguishable from the incense that pervaded most monastic churches. Yet the story and the accompanying relic had drawn crowds and emptied purses. The system was self perpetuating. The need for funds to maintain the abbeys, to support the monks, to perform charitable works, created a constant demand for pilgrims. And to attract pilgrims, the relics had to be special, their stories extraordinary. This, in turn, led to the embellishment of those stories, the creation of new relics, and the subtle, or not so subtle, manipulation of belief. It was a cycle driven by a complex interplay of faith, necessity, and a very human desire for material prosperity. Brother Thomas began to wonder about the true nature of his own pilgrimage. He had come seeking spiritual enlightenment, a deeper understanding of God's grace, but he had also, inadvertently, become a participant in this elaborate economy of faith. He had purchased a small medal, a token of his devotion, and he had observed the transactions, the whispered tales, the carefully curated displays of sanctity. He saw how the desire for miracles, for divine favor, for tangible proof of the saint's power could be exploited. He thought back to his own village, to the stories of relics that occasionally passed through, often brought by itinerant monks. There was the bone fragment, allegedly from St. Jude, that guaranteed a good harvest. There was the piece of cloth, supposedly from St. Agatha's veil, that protected against fires. He had always accepted these stories at face value, as comforting tales that bolstered the community's faith. Now, he wondered how many of those stories had been similarly crafted, how many of those relics had been discovered to meet a specific need, how many of those prayers for prosperity or protection were in reality merely payments for a well-told tale. The line between sincere devotion and calculated marketing was blurred, almost indistinguishable. The monks were not necessarily wicked men, driven by avarice. Many were undoubtedly devout, committed to their religious vows, but the structures in which they operated, the constant need for financial support, and the deeply ingrained cultural belief in the power of relics created an environment where such practices could flourish, often without conscious moral compromise. It was a matter of necessity, of survival, and perhaps of a perverted sense of duty to their monastic institutions. Brother Thomas found himself caught in a moral quandary. He believed in the sanctity of relics, in the power of intercession, but he also believed in the importance of truth, of honesty. How could he reconcile these two seemingly conflicting aspects of his experience? Was it possible to believe in the divine power of a relic without being complicit in the deception that often accompanied its presentation? He decided that his path forward was not to reject the faith, but to understand it more deeply, to seek the truth behind the embellishments. He would continue to observe, to question, and to learn, For in the intricate tapestry of medieval pilgrimage, the threads of faith, commerce, and fabrication were so tightly interwoven that to pull on one was to unravel the other, revealing a complex and often unsettling reality. The spoils of the road, he realized, were not just in the tangible objects exchanged, but also in the stories that gave them meaning and the human ingenuity, however morally ambiguous, that crafted those stories. He understood now that the legends of the saints were not merely accounts of their lives, but also vibrant, evolving narratives shaped by the needs and desires of those who sought to profit from their memory. And in that understanding lay a different kind of treasure, a deeper insight into the human heart and the enduring power of belief in all its flawed, beautiful complexity. He left the shrine of St. Alaric with a heavier purse than he had arrived with, but with a far heavier heart, burdened by the knowledge that the divine, as it was often presented, was a commodity, and its price was paid not only in coin, but also in the currency of truth. The journey had taught him much, not least about the enduring power of storytelling and the very human capacity to weave a miracle from the threads of everyday life, for good or for ill. The road back was rarely a mirror of the road out. The outward journey, a tapestry woven with anticipation, prayer, and the nervous energy of the unknown, often gave way on the return to a quieter, more introspective mood. The same dust that had settled upon them on their arrival now clung to their tired limbs. The same sun that had warmed them now seemed to bake the weariness into their very bones. Yet, within Ilara, a subtle transformation had occurred, a hardening of the spirit, a shedding of the naive girl who had set out with trembling hands and a heart brimming with unspoken fears. Her frame, once delicate, now bore the lean resilience of someone who had learned to navigate hardship. Her eyes, though shadowed with fatigue, held a new steadiness, a quiet knowing. The trinkets she carried, a smooth gray stone from the river where a blessed martyr was said to have washed his feet, a sprig of dried lavender, its scent almost entirely faded from a wayside shrine that had offered a moment of respite, a small, intricately carved wooden bird, its paint chipped and faded, purchased with her last few coins, were not merely souvenirs. They were talismans, tangible anchors to the invisible currents of faith and perseverance that had carried her through. Each held a story, a fragment of the vast, unfolding narrative of their pilgrimage, waiting to be unfurled like a precious scroll. Brother Thomas, too, found his inner landscape irrevocably altered. The earnest faith he had carried from his cloistered life had been both challenged and refined. He had witnessed the divine woven into the fabric of human frailty, the sacred intertwined with the mundane, the sincere devotion of pilgrims standing alongside the calculated machinations of those who curated their faith. His quiet observations, once a gentle contemplation, had become a profound meditation on the nature of belief itself. He had seen the earnestness of a peasant woman pressing a worn wooden cross to her lips, her face a testament to desperate hope, and he had overheard the whispered pronouncements of a friar, his words carefully crafted to elicit a more generous offering. The experience was not one of disillusionment, but of a deeper, more complex understanding. The saints, he now knew, were not merely ethereal beings dispensing miracles from on high, but figures whose earthly lives, however extraordinary, were subject to the interpretations, the needs, and the storytelling of those who venerated them. His faith had not been broken, it had been rendered more human, more nuanced, and in its own way more profound. He carried with him not just the scent of incense and the dust of the road, but the weight of unanswerable questions, the quiet recognition of humanity's capacity for both sublime faith and subtle artifice. The physical toll of the journey was undeniable. The miles had etched themselves onto their bodies. Ilara's feet were calloused and often ached with a deep, persistent throb, a constant reminder of the ground covered. Brother Thomas's knees creaked with each step, a testament to countless hours spent kneeling in prayer and the persistent weariness of long marches. But beneath the physical exhaustion lay a different kind of strength, a nascent resilience, forged in shared hardship and solitary reflection. They had faced the elements, the uncertainty of the path, the gnawing hunger, and the persistent fatigue, and they had endured. This endurance was not merely a physical feat, it was a testament to the inner resolve that had been steadily building, brick by painstaking brick, with each sunrise and sunset experienced on the road. As they drew closer to the familiar landscapes of their starting point, a new anticipation began to stir, distinct from the hopeful yearning that had propelled them outward. This was the anticipation of return, the eagerness to share the immense weight of their experiences, to translate the intangible into words that might resonate with those who had remained behind, tethered to their ordinary lives. They yearned to recount the grand narratives, the whispered legends, the quiet moments of unexpected grace. Ilara imagined the wide eyes of her younger siblings as she described the soaring cathedrals, the vibrant processions, the sheer, overwhelming spectacle of the pilgrimage's sacred heart. Brother Thomas envisioned the hushed reverence of his fellow monks as he recounted his observations, his insights into the intricate dance between faith and commerce, the human element that colored even the most sacred of devotions. There was a curious burden to these tales, a precious weight that needed to be carefully carried and lovingly shared. It was not merely a recounting of events, but an act of interpretation, of weaving the disparate threads of their journey into a coherent tapestry for those who had not walked the path. The stories were not just observations, they were transformations, embodiments of the spiritual and emotional evolution they had undergone. Each miracle recounted, each act of piety witnessed, each moment of doubt or despair overcome, was imbued with a newfound significance, a deeper resonance born from their own trials. They were no longer just pilgrims, they were storytellers, carrying with them the echoes of a sacred quest, eager to impart its wisdom, its wonder, and its quiet truths to the world they were returning to. The anticipation of sharing was a powerful balm, a gentle counterpoint to the weariness, a reminder of the purpose that lay beyond the mere physical act of travel. They carried not just the dust of the road, but the seeds of renewed faith, waiting to be sown in the fertile ground of familiar hearts and minds. The journey had ended, but the recounting, the sharing, the integration of their experiences into the ongoing narrative of their lives was about to begin. The spoils of the road were not solely the tangible trinkets and the memories etched in their minds, but the very capacity to articulate the ineffable, to bridge the gap between the sacred and the secular, and to carry the transformative power of their pilgrimage back into the heart of their everyday existence. The dust of distant shrines and the scent of foreign incense still clung to them, a subtle perfume that marked them as different. As Ilara and Brother Thomas re entered the familiar embrace of their village, they were not merely returning travelers, but carriers of stories, living embodiments of the extraordinary woven into the fabric of the ordinary. The road, with its trials and triumphs, had bestowed upon them a unique currency, social capital, minted in hardship and polished by the awe of those who had remained behind. In the eyes of her neighbors, Ilara was no longer just the girl who tended the family garden or fetched water from the well. She was Ilara, the pilgrim, the one who had seen the hallowed relics, who had slept under the indifferent gaze of 1,000 stars, who had faced down the gnawing fear of the unknown on treacherous paths. The hushed whispers that greeted her arrival were a testament to this transformation. Children, their faces alight with wonder, would press themselves against the low stone walls of their cottages, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of her, their imaginations already painting vivid pictures of her journey. Mothers would nod knowingly, a mixture of admiration and a touch of apprehension in their gazes, as if the very act of surviving such a venture was a feat in itself, a testament to a strength they themselves might not possess. The communal gatherings, once centered around the mundane rhythms of harvest and market day, now gravitated towards Ilara. They would gather around her, their faces turned expectantly, their questions a torrent of curiosity. "Tell us, Ilara," they'd implore, their voices hushed with reverence. "Was it truly as grand as the tales say? Did you see the very bones of St. Jude?" Her recounting of the journey, a carefully curated blend of truth and embellishment, became communal lore. The minor inconveniences of the road, a blistered heel, a night spent in damp lodgings, were amplified, transmuted into harrowing ordeals. A near miss with a pack of wolves became a terrifying confrontation with a demonic horde, their eyes glinting like coals in the darkness. The simple act of sharing a meager meal with a fellow pilgrim was spun into a tale of profound fellowship, a testament to the spiritual bonds forged in the crucible of shared suffering. These narratives were not mere entertainment, they were a form of currency, bestowing upon Ilara a status that transcended her previous social standing. She commanded a certain deference, her opinions sought on matters beyond her former station. The ability to speak with authority about distant lands, about the customs of other peoples, about the very presence of the divine, made her a valuable member of the community. The bragging rights, though unspoken, were palpable. To have endured, to have seen, to have returned, these were accomplishments that elevated one above the common herd. There was a subtle pride in her voice as she described the sheer scale of the cathedral, the dazzling array of jewels adorning a holy icon, the collective gasp of the faithful as a relic was raised aloft. These were not merely memories, they were trophies of her resilience, her faith, and her daring. Brother Thomas found himself in a similar, albeit more nuanced, position. While Alara's status was one of almost celebrity, his was one of earned wisdom. His fellow monks, cloistered in their routine, viewed his return with a mixture of respect and intellectual curiosity. They had heard the tales of the pilgrimage, of course, but their understanding was filtered through the lens of religious dogma and the abstract theology they studied. Thomas, however, had seen the pilgrimage with his own eyes, had breathed its air, had witnessed its myriad manifestations. His accounts were not of thrilling escapes or dazzling spectacles, but of the intricate interplay between faith and human nature. He spoke of the earnest devotion of the simple folk, whose faith was as robust and unyielding as the ancient stones of the churches they visited. He described, with a quiet gravity, the calculated pronouncements of some preachers, their words crafted to stir the emotions and loosen the purse strings of the pilgrims. He recounted conversations with fellow travelers, the deep theological debates that erupted around flickering campfires, the quiet moments of shared prayer that transcended denominational differences. The bragging rights for Brother Thomas were of a different sort. They were not about outward displays of bravery or the acquisition of tangible wonders, but about the internal landscape of faith. He had seen and understood the complexities, the shades of gray that existed even within the most sacred of journeys. His tales were of spiritual discernment, of the challenges to faith posed by the world, and of the enduring power of belief in the face of doubt. He spoke of the profound beauty he had witnessed, yes, but also of the subtle manipulations, the human fallibility that colored even the most holy of endeavors. This deeper understanding, this nuanced perspective, was his true spoil. It was a form of intellectual and spiritual capital that set him apart, earning him the respect of his peers, not for surviving the road, but for understanding its profound lessons. The subtle elevation in their social standing was not always welcomed by everyone. Some, who had lacked the means or the courage to undertake such a journey themselves, might harbor a quiet resentment. The returned pilgrim, with their tales of arduous travel and divine favor, could serve as a constant, unspoken reminder of their own limitations. Yet, even in these cases, the awe usually outweighed the envy. For most, the pilgrim was a window to a world beyond their own, a source of inspiration and a testament to the enduring power of faith and human perseverance. The road, in its own way, had enriched not just the travelers, but the communities they returned to, bringing with them the echoes of distant lands and the whispers of the divine. The yearning for the road, once sated by the return, began to reassert itself with a subtle persistence, a quiet hum beneath the surface of daily life. It was a familiar ache, not of the body, but of the spirit, a recognition that the end of one journey was merely the prelude to another. For many, the pilgrimage was not a singular event, a destination reached and then departed from, but a recurring tide, pulling them back towards the dust and the devotion, the hardship and the hope. Even as the memories of the recent journey remained vivid, the mind, or perhaps more accurately, the soul, began to turn its gaze forward to the distant spires and the hallowed relics that lay yet unvisited. The act of seeking, the very process of enduring, had become for some more profound than the arrival. Brother Thomas found himself increasingly caught in this eddy of reflection. The quiet rhythms of the monastery, once a source of solace and order, now seemed to amplify the questions that had been stirred within him on the road. He would sit in the scriptorium, his quill poised above the vellum, the familiar Latin phrases blurring before his eyes as his thoughts drifted. He saw, with a clarity that sometimes startled him, that the spiritual fulfillment he craved was not to be found in a specific location, not in the cold stone of a particular saint's tomb, nor in the echo of hymns within a grand cathedral. It was in the act of movement itself, in the constant unfolding of the path ahead, in the stripping away of comfort and the reliance on something greater than oneself. The road was a crucible, and it was in its fires that the soul was truly tested and refined. He recalled the faces of his fellow travelers, etched with fatigue and devotion, their shared meals of coarse bread and thin broth imbued with a sacred significance. He remembered the shared laughter that erupted unexpectedly after days of silence, the quiet tears shed over a forgotten prayer, the fierce arguments about the nature of divinity that flared and then subsided like summer storms. These were the moments that held the true essence of his pilgrimage, not the distant, static relics, but the dynamic human experience of seeking. The destination, he realized, was an illusion, a convenient marker on a path that was, in its entirety, holy. The shrine was but a focal point, a beacon that drew the faithful, but the journey to it was where the true work of transformation took place. The spiritual quest, he mused, was not a mountain to be climbed and conquered, but a river to be navigated, with its currents and its shallows, its rapids and its calm stretches. To stand still was to risk stagnation, to allow the waters of faith to grow stagnant and fouled. It was in the continuous flow, the relentless forward motion, that life and vitality were maintained. He had encountered pilgrims who had made the same journey countless times, their bodies worn, but their spirits seemingly rejuvenated by the repetition. They spoke not of new sights, but of deeper understandings, of subtle shifts in perspective that only repeated exposure could bring. For them, the pilgrimage was a life's work, a continuous weaving of spiritual experience, each journey adding another thread to an ever expanding tapestry. He considered his own path. Had he returned to the monastery to rest or to retreat? The question gnawed at him. The outward appearance was one of completion, of a duty fulfilled, but inwardly, the road had merely opened a new vista, a realization that the horizon he had sought was not a fixed point, but an ever receding line. The very act of witnessing the faith of others, the unshakable conviction of simple folk who believed with their entire beings, had ignited a deeper questioning within him. He had seen the spectrum of human devotion, from the most fervent and selfless to the most self serving and theatrical. This immersion in the messy, vibrant reality of faith had shown him that piety was not a monolithic entity, but 1,000 different shades, each one illuminated by the light of individual experience. The road had a way of stripping away pretenses, of revealing the raw, unvarnished core of a person. In the shared vulnerability of travel, social hierarchies blurred, and the simple bonds of shared humanity took precedence. A wealthy merchant and a humble peasant could find common ground over a shared fire, their differences momentarily erased by the universal need for warmth and fellowship. Thomas had participated in these exchanges, his monastic vows momentarily set aside in the face of shared experience. He had learned that true wisdom was not confined to cloistered libraries, but could be found in the calloused hands of a farmer or the weathered face of a seasoned traveler. These encounters had enriched him immeasurably, offering perspectives that his books could only hint at. He began to feel a familiar stirring, a nascent anticipation for the next departure. It wasn't a grand, sweeping ambition, but a quiet, insistent pull. Perhaps a smaller shrine, a local pilgrimage to a less renowned saint, a journey not for the grand spectacle, but for the intimate experience. The desire was not to outdo his previous journey, but to continue the dialogue that the road had opened within him. He saw the cyclical nature of this devotion, a rhythm that mirrored the turning of the seasons, the ebb and flow of life itself. To deny this call would be to deny a part of his own becoming. The legacy of pilgrimage, he understood, was not merely in the stories brought back or the souvenirs acquired, but in the invisible, internal restructuring of the pilgrim. It was in the broadened perspective, the deepened empathy, the recalcitrant faith that had been tested, and in its testing had grown stronger. For some, the journey was a penance, a shedding of sins. For others, a thanksgiving, an offering of gratitude. And for men like himself, it was becoming something more complex, a perpetual state of seeking, a testament to the enduring human need to connect with the divine, not in a single decisive moment, but in a continuous, unfolding process. The act of returning, he now recognized, was not a punctuation mark, but a comma. The journey was far from over. It had simply entered a new phase, a period of digestion and contemplation before the inevitable setting forth once more. The road, with its inherent uncertainties and its unexpected consolations, had become more than a means to an end. It was the end itself, the ever present pathway to a deeper understanding of oneself and the world. The spiritual fulfillment he sought was not a hidden treasure waiting to be unearthed at a specific destination, but the very act of digging, the persistent unearthing of meaning with each step taken. The unfinished pilgrimage was, in essence, the most complete pilgrimage of all, for it embraced the totality of the human journey, with all its winding turns and its unyielding call to move forward. The true spoils of the road were not the indulgences or the blessings received at the end, but the enduring transformation wrought within the soul of the traveler, a transformation that demanded and promised continued exploration.